It says that we're live. So
Wow.
I'm going to trust the testimony of my computer and just say that, I mean, it says we have 0 viewers. How could we be live if we have 0 viewers? That's not
Yeah.
metaphysically possible.
Let's assume conservatively that it's saying it's live gives thus a Bayes factor of 1,000,000 to 1 in favor of it being live.
Yes, I think that's, and I think divergent assessments of the evidence are entirely silly. So, okay, I'm here with Dr. Matthew. No, you're not doctor yet, unfortunately. Just maybe 2 more months in your PhD. No, okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Matthew Adelstein. Adelstein? Steen? Okay, sweet. Matthew Adelstein to talk about why atheism is silly. So, Matthew, can you just tell the audience a bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a student studying philosophy. I have a few publications, not as many as Joe, of course, but I have a few. Currently in undergrad, I want to go to grad school in philosophy. I also have a very epic blog that you should check out at Bentham's. It's called Bentham's Bulldog or Bentham's Newsletter, and I have a YouTube channel called Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions. I talk a decent amount about philosophy of religion. I'm a theist, and I sort of was an atheist for most of my life, and then was convinced of theism by these kinds of philosophical arguments. But so maybe this will give me some credibility disagreeing as a theist disagreeing with Cameron's arguments.
Right, but while you're a theist, you don't think atheism is silly. So that's what we're here for. Okay, so yeah. Let's just get straight into the video, shall we? Let's see if I can. Oh, I'm already showing my screen. Now I just need to. I'm so incompetent at this. Oh, here we go. Okay, I'm just gonna trust that it works.
Over the years, I've spent.
Oh, I should say this is on 1.25 times speed for the audience.
Wow.
Countless hours studying atheism, engaging with its arguments, and giving it the benefit of the doubt.
Oh, and Matthew, just like you could start talking if you want to say something, and I'll pause it and back up.
Recently, I made an announcement after over a decade of exploring atheism. I no longer take it seriously. And apparently that statement triggered everybody, like atheists, Christians, you name it. People couldn't help but chime in. Well, today I'm going to put my cards on the table. I'm going to break down exactly why I think atheism is, quite frankly, a pretty silly view. And if your reasoning looks anything like mine, I think you'll see why you shouldn't take it seriously either. Real quick, forgive me, I'm a little bit sick right now. So if
I will say it, so like I don't agree with him that atheism is silly. I think I'd give atheism, maybe around like a bit above 1/3 credence. I think it doesn't have a super low probability. And I agree with your responses to his reasons for finding atheism to be silly in the video you made in response. That said, I don't think there's anything in principle unreasonable about finding a view silly in the sense of just thinking it's really improbable, even if it's sort of a view that's seriously discussed in the scholarly literature and is believed by smart people. Like, for example, so one of the things I read about a lot is anthropics. I won't go into any details about it. But I find the self-sampling assumption, which is one of the major views, and compartmentalized conditionalization, I find these views to be very silly views. My credence in these views together is like below 1%. I don't know if that's true, maybe around 1%. But I don't think there's anything in principle wrong about thinking that, about being really confident in one view. I mean, you shouldn't be confident at 1,000,000 to 1 odds, but it's fine to be confident at 90% odds or something. Now, the higher it gets, the slightly dicier it gets. But so I was sort of less opposed to Cameron's initial statement. I disagree with it, but I didn't think there was anything that unreasonable about it. But what I found wrong with this video, as we'll see, is the reasoning behind it I found to be quite dubious.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of put on screen something that Nathan from Digital Gnosis said, where he disentangles taking something to be silly and having a very, very low credence in it. And I think that's an interesting point because, yeah, I mean, I have a very, very low credence in certain controversial philosophical positions, but I don't think I would say that they're silly, precisely because I recognize that, for instance, there are people who are far smarter than me, far more capable than me philosophically, who have, let's say, defended the views for their entire dissertation, who have read the literature far more than me, and who could kind of like own me in a debate about the topic, even though I think the relevant position that they hold is extraordinarily improbable. And that kind of leads me to think that like I wouldn't really call the position silly. So I don't have like precise, necessary, and sufficient conditions for what counts as silly. But like we might want to disentangle having a very, very low credence in something and taking that thing to be silly. And it seems to me, at least, that taking something to be silly is an even stronger claim than having a very, very low credence. Because again, I have very, very low credence in various things that I don't say are silly, and I still say like are worth taking seriously. But that's one thing that I might want to say.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. And I think certainly calling it silly is like an unnecessarily inflammatory way of saying it. Like it seemed like
but
what,
you need
what
views.
he was saying was,
See, I mean, I think we can forgive him for that because I mean we need views, but oh well. Let's continue.
Yeah.
I sound congested, just bear with me. All right, so here's what makes this video unique. Okay, I'm not just going to talk at you about philosophy. I want to bring math to the table. So using probability theory and some awesome, amazing new software that I built over Christmas. Yes, I code on my holidays. I'll visually demonstrate why atheism is non-serious. And don't worry, you don't need a PhD in math to follow.
Well, he'll demonstrate it conditional on his grotesquely controversial first order assessments about the strength of the evidence for theism and against atheism, which like most of the relevant experts disagree about. But that's one thing that I wanted to add there.
Like I don't think that the relevant, like, so I mean, as we'll see as we get into the video, you know, he's going to be having some unique Bayes factors for certain bits of evidence, where he's going to say certain bits of evidence are like way more likely on one theory than another theory. Now, if you think this is true for each of the bits of evidence, you don't really need the fancy Bayes like calculator that visually represents it in order to see that, you know, if you take there to be three different things that are each like 10 million times as likely on one theory as another, you'll generally think that that theory is right and the other theory is wrong. This is the sort of thing that you don't need a bar chart in order to conclude.
Right. Yeah. So, like, I mean, the broader point here is like, hey, if you agree with me that theism predicts these things like many, many, many millions of times more than atheism, well, then you'll assign a super duper low credence to atheism, which is like, okay. But anyway, let's get back.
Right.
There's much.
I think it's misleading to call it like the visual demonstration. Like, really, the visual bit is just like the thing that is controversial isn't anything that goes into the thing that's being represented visually. The thing that's controversial is just the substantive philosophical claims that you're making. Right. So, okay. So like, oh, here's a visual demonstration. So imagine, you know, some Thomist comes along and says, oh, I have a visual demonstration of of theism. Okay. Okay. First of all, theism is rendered certain by the de ente argument. Oh, and then here's this little bar chart that demonstrates this little, you know, this chart that shows my credences between theism and atheism. Oh, look, it's all occupied by theism. It'd be a bit misleading to call it a visual demonstration, though controversial bit is not like the part going into the visual demonstration. It's the substantive philosophical claims that they're making as part of it.
Right, and if people are interested in that argument in particular, they could check out my book. And I think it's, what is it, like section 7.3.8 or something like that on that argument. So people can check that out if they're interested. If you can't afford it, email me and I can help. I have little wizard powers that I can. Okay, that's hey, Dan Linford's here. He's at AR book. Yes. Okay, let's get back. I'm now accidentally sharing things. Okay, sorry, I'm very incompetent at being a host for live things. But let's go back to the video and our pal Cameron.
Follow along with this video. The software is going to make it super easy to follow, and I promise it's actually going to blow your mind. Like, this video has the potential to skyrocket your level of credence in the existence of God. Before we dive into the good stuff of this video, let me just quickly recap the main point of my last video, because some folks unsurprisingly misunderstood what my point was. Here's what I said. Okay, even if we grant atheism the so-called best argument, the problem of evil, it still does not prove atheism is true. At best, it might challenge the idea that the creator is all-powerful or morally perfect, but it doesn't establish that the creator doesn't exist. Now, let me clear up another big misconception. When I say I no longer take atheism seriously, what I mean is that I no longer take it as a serious contender to theism. Some people think that the problem of evil makes atheism more likely than theism, or that it's some kind of like theism destroying a trump card. But let me be blunt. That is obviously false. The existence of evil doesn't magically make atheism the most reasonable explanation of reality. So in this video, I'm going to show you step by step why that's the case.
I mean, one thing I want to say here is like, maybe there are certain. Oh, maybe have we lost Matthew? That would not be good. We might have lost Matthew. Well, now it's just me here to. Should I start dancing? Oh, we did lose Matthew. I should start dancing. Should I take off my shirt and start stripping? Tell me in the comment section if I should do that. That'd be pretty fun. Okay, so I guess while we wait for Matthew. Oh, Matthew's back. Okay, Matthew, you've returned. I was telling them that I was going to start taking off my shirt and like strip dancing, but looks like you've. I think you're frozen again.
Yeah.
But you've canceled those plans. How does that make you feel? Well. Oh, are you back? Sorry, folks.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry for the technical errors. I think I'm back now.
Okay. Sweet. Well, you interrupted the
yeah.
plan. Sorry, maybe audience, that will happen another time. But I guess I wanted to say one thing here about Cameron's video, which is, I don't know, it seems to me that he may very well be sort of shifting the goalposts with respect to his argument. In other words, just kind of like changing his argument from the original video to this video. It seems to me that Cameron was originally inferring that he shouldn't take atheism seriously from the fact that the main and most powerful pieces of like purported evidence for atheism, like evil, don't actually disfavor certain versions of theism, right? Like limited God views. It seemed to me that that's what he was arguing. But as I pointed out in my original response video, that's not good reasoning. That doesn't follow. It's not a good difference because a collection of data, like various facts about evil, hiddenness, etc., can easily render a general hypothesis like theism improbable, or at least render global atheism sufficiently probable to be worth taking seriously, even if that collection of evidence favors or confirms specific variants of generic theism. So contrast that with the reasoning that Cameron is giving in this video, which I'm sure our audience has already sort of listened to. The reasoning that Cameron is giving in this video, it seems to me, was just like not the reasoning that Cameron was forwarding in his original video on why he doesn't take atheism seriously. In the original video, again, we just find like no assertion to the effect that atheism is rendered freakishly, ludicrously improbable by the theistic arguments, like fine-tuning, etc., prior to conditionalizing on evil. Right? That just wasn't in there. If that were in there and part of his reasoning originally, I would have pounced on that, right? I would have highlighted that in my response. And I would have highlighted that that still isn't sufficient grounds for being justified in not taking atheism seriously, since I think divergent assessments of the first order evidence here are still worth taking seriously. And those divergent assessments can render atheism very much a live option. And also, I would have also directly contested his first order judgment about the strength of the evidence, pointing to places where like I and others have offered, at least by my lights, plausible replies to the arguments that he thinks works. So in short, I do think Cameron is sort of like shifting the goalposts. In his original video, nowhere did he say or justify the claim that the evidence, in his view, apart from evil, makes atheism ludicrously improbable. So improbable, in fact, that conditionalizing on evil really won't change things, even being quite generous to the problem of evil. Whereas Cameron, in his new video, that's the central focus. And he's no longer kind of focusing on, seems to me, like the inference from the problem of evil, not like disproving generic theism that atheism is no longer to be taken seriously. So I don't know. It seems like, and because of that, it seems to me that like none of my 4 original rejoinders in my original response video are addressed, and that they all stand to the original argument in his original video. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Hey, sorry, I was frozen again. Sorry, it seems like my internet's not great. But
okay, well, you're back now. So, but anyway, do you have anything to add before we continue on with Cameron's video?
I mean, I think I'm largely in agreement. I mean, yeah. I mostly agreed with the bits that I heard.
Okay, so let's go back to Cameron.
Case, but you got to stick around to the end to see it all sort of laid out, all the reasoning. So if you've ever heard the problem of evil touted as this like ultimate argument for atheism, stick around. You're about to see a beautiful visual refutation of that claim. So here's what's coming up. I'm going to walk you through some of the strongest evidence for theism, and we're going to assign probabilities to that evidence. But don't worry, it's going to be all visual. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be super easy to follow. No math degree required. Then once we've got a sort of rough idea of how likely theism is based on the evidence, we're going to flip the script and look at atheism's best shot, the problem of evil. Spoiler alert, it's not going to do what atheists think it does.
I mean, one assumption that is worth flagging here that I don't think, I mean, it's a natural assumption. Cameron hasn't justified it. It's a natural assumption that atheism, or rather that the problem of evil is like the best atheistic consideration or the best atheistic argument. And I know at least a lot of very philosophically informed atheists who actually don't share that assessment. They think that there are even far more powerful considerations than evil. I mean, Graham Oppy is one such atheist. I mean, he doesn't think the problem of evil is the best argument for atheism. I mean, I know Sebastian Montesinos, for instance, from Naturalism Next, he doesn't think he doesn't think evil is the strongest consideration in favor of atheism. So that's just one assumption worth flagging. But maybe it's a fine assumption because I guess maybe most atheists agree with him.
Yeah, and right. I mean, certainly there could be a discussion about that. Though I'm in agreement that I think the problem of evil is the best argument. And even, I mean, with a lot of Sebastian's arguments, like they do seem to be sort of variants of the problem of evil. Like one that he's fond of is like the inferior anthropic argument, something that I think a guy named like Mark Walker or something came up with, where the idea is like, it's puzzling that if God exists, he'd create creatures as deficient as we are, when he could create beings that are infinitely better than us. But, that just seems like a variant of, the problem of evil is just Broadway. Why do things suck? And that's a way in which things suck. One of the things that suck is us relative to the space of conceivable agents. So, certainly, Cameron hasn't justified that the problem of evil is the biggest argument for atheism, though I'm inclined to agree with him.
Again, I just wanted to flag that as an assumption. This is part of philosophy, folks. Like you flag assumptions when they come up and make people aware of them in case one might want to contest them, even if one ultimately agrees with them. I actually probably do agree with Cameron that evil is, or at least certain facts about evil are the strongest consideration in favor of atheism. Okay, but let's continue with Cameron. Oh no, I guess I wanted to say one other thing, which is that like this is a very sort of superficial analysis because we were only considering 3 pieces of evidence for theism and 1 piece of evidence for atheism, when in reality, things are far, 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 far more complex than that. And when you bring in more independent pieces of evidence, they can actually have drastic probabilistic effects when you sort of multiply them together and do all the fun mathy stuff. So given that there like really are like hundreds of arguments for atheism, or at least hundreds of arguments for like local atheism with respect to omnitheism, many of which can be duly served as arguments for global atheism. It's a very superficial analysis to only look at 1 piece of evidence for atheism and then like sort of conclude from that you've sort of visually demonstrated that atheism is silly by looking at a single piece of evidence and comparing it to 3 pieces of evidence for theism. Like what?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in Cameron's defense, if you agree with the numbers you give that he gives in this video, then basically no matter how else the other evidence is going to be outweighed by this. If you give the evidential factor for these pieces of evidence.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm just thinking of fine tuning. Let's say
probably that'll outweigh the other evidence, but perhaps the numbers are overconfident. If you think like this 3 pieces of evidence just basically swamps whatever could conceivably be on the atheist side, even though.
He's freezing again. I'm sorry, folks. Okay. Now you're back. I think you're back. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
What I was gonna say, what I was gonna say is like maybe that's the case. What you were just saying, maybe that's the case. Although, I mean, just take the 10 to the power of 150. Let's say that there's like a Bayes factor, which is like 10 to the power of 150. I mean, if we have, let's say, 50 pieces of independent evidence for atheism, among that, 200 or so argument list that Felipe Leon has. And let's say we take each of those to be like 10,000, 1,000 times more probable on atheism than theism. And if they're independent, I mean, that's going to be, 10 to the 3 and 50 of those. So 10 to the 150. I mean,
yeah.
So I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. If you treat all the bits of evidence, sort of like I think the way Cameron is treating the evidence on his side, where you treat them basically as independent and you give them ridiculous, you continue giving them ridiculous Bayes factors even as you stack many of them next to each other, then you might get it overwhelming the high Bayes factors here. But of course,
Yeah.
you should simply not do that. Like stacking up lots of pieces of evidence, there's a tendency to like give an overly high degree of weight to like evidence that's late in the sequence, even after you've updated on 10 things, on lots of things. I have updated the first 15 things. And then, lots of people will count each of the next evidence. And so the next, 100 things count as massively more evidence. And this is generally a recipe for this. Generally, after updating on the first 10 things, it's highly unlikely that, if the first 10 considerations will give you 10 billion to 1 odds or something in favor of the conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that I think is perhaps missing from Cameron's analysis, and unfortunately was considering the dependence of these pieces of evidence on one another. So when you update on, let's say, order, and then you want to go on to evaluate the probabilistic effect of fine-tuning, you need to be putting order in your background then. And then you need to be assessing how probable is the fine-tuning data given the respective hypotheses and order, right? And that may very well be different from how probable the fine-tuning data is, just conditional on the respective hypotheses. So I think that element of this analysis was crucially missing from Cameron's case. And I actually also do think it'll weaken Cameron's case, precisely because we might think that, fine-tuning, the probability of fine-tuning given an orderly universe is actually higher than just the probability of fine-tuning itself on, let's say, naturalism. So, and similarly for other sorts of things, like you might think that consciousness is more likely to arise in a kind of orderly universe, etc. But anyway, that's just something that I wanted to flag for the audience. So that's another kind of aspect that was, I think, poorly missing from Cameron's analysis, and which should significantly detract our confidence in his analysis. But anyway, let's continue on.
Even if we give it way more credit than it deserves, it's still not going to establish atheism as the most likely explanation of reality. And just as a quick heads up, I've got a longer live stream planned where we'll take a deeper dive into even more evidence for theism. I'll be teaming up with experts like Luke Barnes and Robin Collins. Trust me, it's going to be well worth your time. More on that later, though. Let's get to the good stuff. All right, let me introduce you to the star of today's show, my brand new, beautiful new software here.
Say one other thing about the previous points. What you're saying, if you grant the really high Bayes factors, right? So if you think that order or something knocks out 99.99999% of conceivable magic views of realism of 0.01% or something. Well, axiarchism is a significant share of your remaining probability space. And then if an axiarchism is a significant share of your remaining probability space, well, then once you update on the other stuff, axiarchism will have a decent explanation of the other stuff. So after you update on the first bit of evidence, if you think the first bit of evidence is massive evidence, then the thing that remains are going to be these sort of plausible near-theistic competitors. And then those are going to be decent explanations of the latter bits of evidence. So it's especially the case that you shouldn't treat them as independent if you're treating them as 10 million to 1 updates or something.
Yeah, Matthew, turn off your camera if you can, because you're breaking up a little bit, and that'll save bandwidth. Okay, and can you just briefly summarize the point you just made? Because at the beginning, when you were saying important things that were setting the stage for your point, we basically lost those. So if you could just summarize your point again.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So the point was that if you're taking into account lots of bits of evidence, if you count them as really, really strong evidence, then you should be even less prone to treat them as independent, because you grant that like, so let's say you say order is like, 10 million to 1 evidence against atheism. Well, think about the atheistic hypotheses that are on the table to explain order. If you think basically nearly all of atheism is eliminated. Well, so long as you think, say, axiarchism has a prior more than 1 in 10 million, then now axiarchism will be a decent share of the remaining probability space. Same thing with, like, I don't know, natural teleology. These things that, are in some way value directed. And then once you have this being a significant share of the remaining atheism probability space, well, fine-tuning is not going to be very much evidence, because conditional on axiarchism, fine-tuning isn't very surprising. In fact, axiarchism seems to make exactly the same predictions as theism does.
Right. So this is actually a point that I had in my notes that I was going to bring up later on, which I think just shows a massive mistake in Cameron's reasoning and in his video, which is, it was also, especially when he brought up the point about, like, well, hey, multiverse will only take up a tiny sliver of atheism's probability space. What he was neglecting there is that, well, hey, if the multiverse hypothesis within the atheistic portion of the probability space nevertheless predicts the data pretty well, whereas the other atheistic hypotheses predict it poorly, and etc., then when we update on the relevant evidence, that little portion of the probability space is going to expand. It's going to get bigger. And then the other portions of the atheistic probability space are going to get much smaller. And then when you go forward in making predictions, the predictions of atheism are going to be largely driven by the predictions of multiverse atheism specifically, in which case, arguably, fine-tuning then is not going to be significant evidence against atheism. Whereas Cameron is, his reasoning is largely driven by fine-tuning having this ginormous Bayes factor, etc. So, like, this is also another huge, crucial mistake that I think Cameron made in his probabilistic reasoning. So let's, are you ready to continue? We're kind of jumping the gun on a lot of the criticisms, but
yeah.
Okay.
Whoops.
Okay, so let's just move on.
Here it is. Dun, 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 dun. Boom. There it is. Dynamic Bayesian bar chart. That's just, I don't really have a name for it yet, but this little creation of mine, I think, is going to blow some minds. But before we jump into the first piece of evidence for theism, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork. So in this video, we'll be comparing 3 different hypotheses. 1, perfect being theism, the idea that a perfect being exists with all of the omnis, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. 2, limited theism. This covers any view where some sort of deity exists but is not perfect. So it's basically like the non-perfect being theism version of theism. And then the third hypothesis is the view, atheism is the view that there are no gods at all. To keep things as simple.
So this is another point that I wanted to raise criticisms at. Why are we just doing this, like, super nondescript, generic, atheistic hypothesis as the competing hypothesis? I mean, like, atheism, again, as Cameron is using it, is just the hypothesis that there are no gods. And that's just a ginormous disjunction of boatloads of different atheistic views, which have vastly divergent predictions. Some of which are going to be predicting fine-tuning and order and consciousness actually pretty well, like ones where the atheistic foundation of reality is directed towards producing things of value, much like the theist posits something which is directed towards producing things of value by virtue of its omnibenevolence. In fact, that's one of the primary ways that theism gets its predictive power, is by virtue of God's directedness towards value. And so, like, if we were to instead break up the atheistic probability space, like Cameron broke up the theistic probability space, into, let's say, undirected atheistic views, where the atheistic fundamental reality or whatever doesn't give a damn about value, whereas the other way that you break it up, the other sub-atheistic hypothesis, is value-directed atheism, where the fundamental atheistic reality is directed towards producing things of value. Those are going to be vastly divergent in their predictions. And arguably, the various things that Cameron is saying are very well predicted by theism are also going to be very, very well predicted by the value-directed atheistic views. And that is going to be then keeping atheism as having a very significant chunk of the overall probability space, even by the end of the overall analysis, in which case atheism wouldn't be silly and Cameron's ultimate conclusion wouldn't follow. So this is, yet again, another, I think, huge mistake in Cameron's probabilistic analysis, is failing to consider that we shouldn't just be treating atheism's predictions as, say, the predictions of a kind of undirected naturalistic view, and then failing to break up the atheistic probability space into value-directed hypotheses and value-undirected hypotheses, just as he broke up theism into the limited God and unlimited God hypotheses. So do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think when Cameron is using the word atheism, like really what he has in mind is naturalism. It's like, think about how unsurprising these things are on naturalism. And the point is, once you're treating the evidence, like these multiple pieces of evidence, as like massively confirmatory, then if there's anything that explains the data that has a prior of even like 1 in 10,000, now if Cameron's right about how bad this evidence is for naturalism, this will now just vacuum up basically all of the atheist probability space and will make atheism not look that bad in terms of the probability calculus. There's a sort of more general. Okay, no, now I'll save this thought for later because I don't want to jump the gun.
Yeah. Let's continue back with Cameron.
Theism. And then the third hypothesis is the view, atheism is the view that there are no gods at all. To keep things as simple and as easy as possible for the audience, we're going to start with equal prior probabilities, 50% for atheism, 50% for theism. Then we're going to split theism evenly between perfect being theism and limited theism, giving each a starting point of 25%. So let's go ahead and plug this into my software now. All right, first thing we got to do is label.
Just for the audience, for the various reasons in my previous response video to Cameron, I think limited theism should have an incredibly low prior. I just wanted to say that. That's also another thing that I at least wanted to flag.
Yeah, I agree.
Perfect being theism, PBT. Whoops, PBT. All right, our next proposition, we're going to give that one a starting percentage of 25%. Next one is limited theism, and we'll give it a probability before we look at the evidence. So don't stress if you think that these numbers should be tweaked at all. Tweaking the priors is not really going to change the final result, the final conclusion that I'm going to reach in this video. And for any of you sort of nerds out there watching, this is
well, I mean, tweaking the priors in certain ways actually would affect it. I mean, if you gave theism, for instance, a ludicrously low, intrinsic probability, or in this case, I guess we're using the term prior probability, but I guess a little more accurately would be intrinsic. So I mean, maybe he was just being very, or we should charitably interpret him, I think, as saying, well, given maybe any reasonable intrinsic probabilities, and given his probability assignments for the Bayes factors, then the initial intrinsic probabilities, so long as they're at least in the bounds of reasonability, won't really make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, though I will say that, there are people who have absurdly low credences in theism on the order of like, they're like, my prior in theism is on the order of 1 in 10 million or something. And I'm quite suspicious of that. I don't think your credence in very hotly contested philosophical propositions, like you should all, if there are like smart people like Josh Rasmussen who thinks theism starts with a prior of like, 60% or something, you shouldn't start out thinking that they have like, being confident at like 100,000 to 1 odds that they're wrong about how to assess the priors. But it's hard to see how Cameron could argue against a person who thinks that theism has a really low prior. I mean, he could just argue against it substantively and say, no, it has a high prior because it's simple. But he can't accuse, like, given the numbers that he's going to be spitting out later, he can't accuse them of just like overconfidence for having big numbers on a philosophical subject that's hotly contested, because he's doing the same thing. His numbers are, also, very, very high on these quite contested philosophical topics.
Let's play.
Not an endorsement of a naive principle of indifference. All right, with that initial setup out of the way, here are the 3 pieces of evidence for theism we're going to cover in this video. So number 1, the universe is orderly. Number 2, the universe is fine-tuned for life. Number 3, there is consciousness. After we work through these 3 pieces of evidence for theism, then we'll introduce the problem of evil, the argument that atheists love to bring up, and we'll see how it impacts the overall situation. All right, let's start with
just, again, I have to reiterate it. It is just weird that like he's like, well, let's bring in 3 pieces of evidence for theism, and then only consider 1 for atheism. It's like, well, I mean, like, talk about stacking the decks from the beginning. But I mean, again, in his defense, he would probably say, well, if I only considered fine tuning, my point would still apply. But anyway, I just wanted to note that.
our first piece of evidence, order. When I talk about order, what I mean is that all objects in the universe are subject to the same laws everywhere and at all times. So no matter where you are, if you're on Earth, the edge of the galaxy, or the farthest, or the farthest reaches of the universe. So for example, if you're in the Star Wars universe, part of the galaxy, everything behaves in exactly the same way with the same powers and the same liabilities. So gravity pulls with the same force, light travels at the same speed no matter where you are in the universe.
The tide goes in, the tide goes out.
And electrons all have the same charge. It's like every clock in the universe is perfectly synchronized, ticking away in harmony without any communication between them. This universal consistency throughout the universe is actually astonishing. It's not exactly something that we would just expect to find.
All right. So one thing that I want to note here is that actually there are sophisticated theories of intrinsic probability that, for instance, Paul Draper has developed and defended, on which uniformities like these, in fact, are intrinsically much more probable, regardless of whether atheism or theism is true. They're intrinsically much more probable than chaos or diversity. And again, that just follows from his, at least in my view, at least somewhat plausible theory of intrinsic probability. And in particular, it's his coherence requirement, which makes uniformity and universally applicable laws considerably more intrinsically probable than ones which admit of exceptions or which are non-uniform in various ways, etc. So this is one thing that I think Cameron's argument here would at least have to address if he wants it to get up and running. And in particular, he's assigning a very, very low probability that we'd see this kind of order under atheism. But at least if Draper's theory of intrinsic probability is correct, that's just mistaken. Order is going to have at least a relatively decent probability, regardless of whether or not theism or atheism is true. And the reason really does ultimately come down to this kind of coherence factor that influences intrinsic probability under Draper's theory, and ultimately has to do with a kind of probabilistic tension that I mentioned in my previous video, the kind of probabilistic tension that I explained and kind of mentioned therein. So if people want to look into that further, they can look into that. But yeah, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, and even if you reject Draper's specific account, one pretty common view is that a simpler theory is more likely. And there are different ways of spelling out simplicity, but one kind of common idea is that part of simplicity has to do with how long it would take in some ideal language to fully spell out the behavior of everything, right? So if you wanted to fully describe what everything does, like how long would you need to do that? Well, it turns out it's much easier to say everything does X, then this thing does X, this thing does Y, this thing does Z, and so on, where each particle follows a different path. And this does seem pretty intuitive. Like it would be weird. It strikes me as very weird and improbable if like every particle just behaved in different ways and they had different structures for just like no discernible reason. This strikes me as relatively improbable. So I actually think my judgment is that the kind of uniformity where the laws of physics are follow these sort of simple, basic mathematical regularities all throughout the universe. I actually think this is evidence for atheism. I think it's decently likely on atheism because atheism will at least plausibly take the laws to be fundamental. But I think it's kind of surprising on theism because there are lots of ways that the laws could be violated in ways that might achieve valuable aims. And it's kind of surprising that God never violates the laws to achieve valuable aims. Or maybe he does rarely in the cases of a miracle. But like on theism, just if I were guessing what the laws would look like from the armchair, I think you would more expect these kind of axiartic laws, where how particles behave, they behave in ways that are predictable enough that you have a, kind of basic order. But they behave in ways that are unpredictable enough, but the ways that they behave is in some way guided towards value. So for example, the rock wouldn't be guided by gravity to fall if it's going to fall on a baby's head. And so I actually think, I don't think it's massive evidence, but this one strikes me as confirming atheism over theism.
Yeah, one other way one might think that this, this also, pertains to considerations relating to the problem of evil, but I would at least expect a perfect agent, not to prioritize like a kind of uniformity and the kind of elegance and, structural similarity that comes along with that at the expense of moral considerations. So that, like if faced with the option of keeping keeping a law of nature uniform, and then alleviating, excruciating, horrific suffering on the part of a sentient being or something like that, my expectation would actually be that, the perfect being would not preserve the order in that case and would instead alleviate the relevant suffering. And that leads me to think that in worlds in which there are, sentient beings whose lives can go better or worse for them, and in which there is order, which can lead to bad states of those beings. My own view is that actually we wouldn't expect uniformly applicable laws in that sort of case. We would actually expect there to be a much more moral kind of order, where moral considerations take priority over these more aesthetic uniformity style considerations. But that's what I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think this is massive evidence, because I think it's pretty likely that whatever explanation you have of the problem of evil will cover this. So, I think the right explanation of the problem of evil will explain sort of why, in a broad sense, the world functions in such in different ways. So maybe you'll have, I don't know, one theodicy that Philip Swenson and Brian Cutter have talked about is they think that basically there were these archons, these angel-like figures that were tasked with making our world really amazing. But these guys, it was difficult, and they basically were asleep on the job and didn't do it. So the reason the world looks indifferent is that the people tasked with making the world not indifferent failed. Now, if you have that task, then it predicts a similar kind of uniformity to the kind of indifference. So I don't think it's massive evidence, because I think probably what you say about the problem of evil and these other things will cover it, or at least the most plausible things to say about the problem of evil. But I do think I think overall this one's I think of the term as an own goal, where overall I think this supports theism. This supports atheism.
Yes. So earlier he was shifting the goalposts, and then after shifting it, he scored an own goal, is what you're saying. Okay, so let's just get back to the video.
By chance. So why does everything follow the same rules? Why do those rules apply everywhere and at all times? Science, for all its magnificent power.
Oh, yeah, sorry, that reminds me. Why do the rules apply everywhere and at all times? I don't know. It seems like theists like Cameron typically don't even believe in universal laws. The law. Hey, the law of gravity applies everywhere and to everyone, except Joseph of Cupertino. He definitely flew dozens of times. Oh, and also except various possessed people that the exorcists that I interview keep talking about, etc. So I'm not even sure if this is even a datum according to Cameron. Seems like there actually are at least quite a deal of violations, or at least maybe we don't want to say violations, but departures or suspensions of otherwise universally holding regularities. So that's another thing that I want to say.
Yeah, I do think he could get around this by just saying the data could be there are these universal laws that hold at the very least in all cases where miracles aren't happening.
Right. I mean, I ultimately, we're not going to get into this. That may introduce certain probabilistic tensions, because we might think that if they hold in all other cases, that gives us reason to think that they hold in these cases. But we're not going to go into that. So anyway, that's stuff that we could talk about further, but we're not going to talk about further. Let's go back to Cameron.
Doesn't answer this question. It doesn't answer it at all. Science assumes that the laws exist, and it uses them as sort of like a foundation for what it does. But it doesn't explain, science does not explain why these laws exist or why they're so consistent throughout the entire universe. All right, back to my software. All right, so here's where my software comes to sort of map this out visually. All right, think of each hypothesis, perfect being theism, limited theism, LT, and atheism, A, as a big sheet of paper. All right, we're gonna assume that we're dealing with pieces of paper. All right, we're going back to elementary school. So each sheet represents the possibility space for that hypothesis. I've also got that represented in bars on the screen. Okay, so this pink area is atheism, yellow area limited theism, blue area perfect being theism. The possibility space refers to everything that's possible if that hypothesis is true. These sheets, imagine that these are sheets, are sized according to their starting probabilities. Okay, 25% for perfect being theism, we've got that here, 25% for limited theism, and then 50% for atheism. Right, that's where we started. When we,
all of this would just be so much better if it were like a Bob Ross segment.
Add the evidence of order, which we're about to do. The software acts almost like a pair of scissors, cutting away sections, like large sections in some cases, of each sheet that don't fit the evidence. The possibility space that doesn't fit the evidence is cut away. After this, it resizes the remaining pieces to add up to 100% again. We're going to see what that looks like visually as well. But this is how we calculate updated probabilities for each hypothesis based on new pieces of evidence. So if you weren't following that, pay attention to this next section. It's really going to help you. And again, we're going to see it visually. So just stick with me. All right. So first, let's go ahead and add our first piece of evidence. This one is going to be labeled order. I'm going to explain what's going on the screen in a second. But first, what we got to do is evaluate the likelihood of the evidence given the various hypotheses. Okay, so here's how the evidence affects the probabilities in this case. So under perfect being theism, that's our first probability we need to assign. Order actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, a perfect being would value rationality, consistency, and beauty, all of which are reflected in universal laws. So order allows.
Okay, a perfect being would value rationality, consistency, and beauty, all of which are reflected in universal laws. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that there are also, though, boatloads of non-universal laws where, the laws fail in just certain outskirts of the universe or something like that, but which nevertheless result in basically the same sorts of rationality, consistency for the most part, and beauty that we see. And in fact, that might exhibit a kind of, hey, maybe a perfect being would also value like spontaneity and non-rigidity. And, oftentimes paintings are made better on the whole by little patches that are less than ideal in themselves. But, there's a kind of organic unity where the kind of badness of that little tiny part makes the whole part, let's say, more aesthetically valuable. I don't see why that also couldn't be the case with respect to the beauty that results from universal laws compared to the beauty that results from laws that are like mostly universal, but maybe there are some exceptions or deviations at certain points. And in fact, as I just pointed out, that may very well be able to contribute to beauty. So it's like, we can also tell these sorts of just so stories for non-uniform or non-universal laws. And I don't know, it makes it very difficult to make predictions. This is more meta point. It makes it difficult to make predictions from theism here. Theistic predictions, at least in my view, are oftentimes a lot more wishy-washy than many apologists would like to let on. And we can tell very similar, plausible sounding just so stories for the exact opposite expectations. So that's just one note of caution that I wanted to put on the audience's radar.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I would maybe disagree a little bit with the last thing you said, but certainly that's an error some apologists make, but I think we could get some predictions out of theism that are fairly evidentially significant.
I didn't say that we can't get any predictions whatsoever that are evidentially significant in any way whatsoever. I just think
I imagine that if you and I sort of evaluate lots of different cases, I imagine I would find it, there would be more cases where it's plausible to make inferences about what God would do. But longer topic for another day.
Right.
And I also think it doesn't seem like the points about rationality and agents being able to make it to take actions in ways that are predictable. Most of this is perfectly compatible with a world where the laws are roughly uniform, but there are sometimes deviations in ways that prevent really bad things from happening. Right. So if rocks didn't kill people, if just the natural laws function roughly regularly, but there weren't earthquakes or tsunamis, that the world would still be a fairly predictable place. And so the only reason not to do this, it would seem, provided by the kinds of justifications that Cameron gives, are the aesthetic considerations, where there's something aesthetically nice about the laws applying everywhere throughout the universe. But this just seems on its face to be a woefully inadequate justification. So imagine you come across someone who made a computer program, and they're a conscious subject in the computer program. And right now, one of the things that is happening in their computer program with these conscious subjects is a virus is jumping over from bats to humans, and it's going to affect millions of people and kill millions of people. And you can stop this, but it would slightly reduce the regularity of the world. You'd have to delete one of the viruses, and this would make it so that there's a deviation from the general laws that apply throughout the universe, because you'd be making an exception. This just seems obviously permissible. And if this is not permissible, well, then what does Cameron think is happening with miracles, right? If it's not permissible for God to intervene to stop COVID from passing over to humans and then infecting and killing millions of people, why is it permissible for God to do miracles to cause a monk to levitate, or or a image to appear atop a church in Egypt. Like, I think maybe some of these miracles did happen, but I don't think that you can have a plausible story that rules out general miraculous claims and that has general order be justified on aesthetic grounds. And then I think the other explanations are even worse than the aesthetic one, because they don't justify they don't justify the degree of order we have. They only justify this sort of minimal degree where that's needed to make decisions.
Yeah, for the most part, I agree with everything you said. One thing that I would also add is that Cameron is about to cite moral agency as requiring something like the uniformity that we see, but it seems to me that it doesn't require universal applicability of laws. It really only requires relatively localized pockets of order and predictability. Like if, for instance, the Milky Way galaxy was exactly as it behaved, and let's say even things within many billions of light years of us, with many billions of light years within the kind of radius of us throughout the history of humanity. If we had order within that sphere and the laws applicable within that sphere, then we'd be able to make all the same choices. We'd have all the same moral significance, etc. And like a single particle, hundreds of billions of light years away or something like that, which just slightly deviates from its path and doesn't thereby follow universal law or something like that. That makes no difference whatsoever to our being able to flourish morally and to make moral decisions, etc. So anyway, let's just continue with Cameron.
Allows, for example, for a stable, predictable universe, a framework where life, creativity, and moral growth can flourish. So it's pretty plausible that a perfect being would actually create a universe with consistent order. So let's conservatively, though, let's be conservative here. We don't want to assign too much of a probability here. Let's assign something like 50%. Okay.
Let's be conservative and give 50%. That's very, very high given everything that we just said. Anyway, given the considerations that we just raised, I think that should be considerably lower.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what it should be, because it's sort of like this. At this point, we have literally nothing in the background, and so I don't know. On theism, the world I would most expect would be this just paradise perfect world. Of course, the world I would most expect on atheism would be nothing or nothing interesting. So, neither theism or atheism predicts with very high probability a world exactly like this one. This world is surprising, I think, on both views. Yeah. So, and then if you just have nothing in the background, would the perfect world have universal laws? It's sort of hard to think through, and it kind of depends on what you're counting as a universal law. So I don't know. Yeah, I think, probably the odds of this are, it depends on exactly what you build and what you count as a law. But yeah, it's hard to think through exactly what this odds. But 50% is not this obviously reasonable conservative number.
Yeah, I think it's way too high given the considerations that we raised. And at least going along with Cameron that we're ignoring the fact that universally applicable laws is intrinsically much more probable than aberrancies here and there, failures of application here and there. If we went along with that point, then perhaps, sure, maybe I'd agree. I still think 50% would be maybe too high, but I'd agree that it'd be decently probable. But that would just destroy, Cameron's case in any case, because then it would also be decently probable on atheism. So basically, either we go along with that sort of intrinsic probability constraint or we don't, in which case I think that this number should be much, much lower. And then we're not going to get as significant an evidential impact for theism. But let's just continue.
Okay, it's 50% likely, 0.5, that a perfect being would create an orderly universe. In this case, what you're seeing is that half of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut. Okay, this lighter area here, imagine that sheet, that part of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut away. Okay, so we're basically saying that at least half of the possibility space on perfect being theism contains order. Half of it contains disorder. That's what this 0.5 or 50% probability sort of represents. All right, let's move on to limited theism. So limited theism could also explain order, but here's the problem with limited theism. Creating a universe where every object follows the same laws everywhere and at all times is actually a really big deal. Like it seems kind of difficult. A limited deity might lack the power, they might lack the knowledge, or even the motivation to achieve such perfect consistency throughout the universe. So while order is definitely possible under limited theism, it's far less likely than it is under perfect being theism. So again, we're going to be conservative. Let's assign this a probability of 10%. So 0.1, and let's see what happens. All right. So basically, in this case, most
seems a bit low. Or let's see. No, that seems reasonable. Like 10% for a limited deity, because the limited deity, maybe it could interfere with the laws in various ways, and so it would probably be in a situation sort of like yeah, okay, this doesn't seem like a crazy number.
Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I mean, like some of the commenters in our live chat, I fall much more on the skeptical side of many of these numbers. I know, Matthew, you and I have talked about this. I mean, I'm okay with like very rough estimates, like, hey, this thing is far, far, far more surprising under one hypothesis over another. I'm generally okay with that sort of thing. And like very, very, very rough comparative estimates. But when we're getting into this, it's like 10% under limited theism, where limited theism is this disjunction of infinitely many different limited God hypotheses, each of which could have vastly different desires for how the universe would be. I don't know. I don't trust it. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like, you shouldn't take these things like too literally. You shouldn't be like, oh, the Bayes factor says this theory is likelier. Okay, so that's the end of the discussion. But I think it does help to, there are all these biases reflecting how we evaluate different bits of evidence, where, for example, we have a tendency to overweight particularly emotionally salient evidence, to underweight lots of different bits of small evidence. So I think it can be a helpful exercise if you're coming to a view to just actually try to assign numbers to these things, and you don't take them too seriously, you don't take them too literally. But I like, if you find that basically no matter how you assign the numbers, as long as you do it in any reasonable way, one view comes out on top, I think that's at least somewhat informative for telling you what view is more likely. So like when I was thinking through the theism versus atheism, I plugged all the numbers into a spreadsheet, and like, that theism seemed to come out better, was one of the things that that informed my decision. Where like the numbers aren't that precise, but if you think basically no matter how you assign the numbers, any reasonable way of doing it, one view comes out on top, then that's pretty significant. But yeah, I don't know. I would recommend reading a blogger that I like named Scott Alexander has an article called something like, if it's worth doing with made up numbers, where he talks about why, even assigning artificial numbers to things is generally a better way of getting these sort of rough Fermi estimates than just going based on purely on your untutored intuition.
Yeah. I mean, I think these can be useful as sort of like toy models, and they can also help actually fight against certain probabilistic biases that we have. And so in that way, I think maybe these rough estimates can be helpful, and these sorts of toy models can be helpful. Although I think we should have still maybe a large degree of higher order uncertainty about, the numbers that we're plugging in, and even potentially the orders of magnitude of the numbers. But maybe, again, given at least like reasonable limits on either side of the range of seemingly reasonable estimates for the numbers, maybe you could even say, like, no matter where you put them, after you do the whole probability Bayes machine goes brrr after you do that, then, and if you find that still one hypothesis is like drastically better than the other, then it seems like, yeah, the toy model could actually be then very helpful in helping you decide in favor of that hypothesis. So I'm not altogether opposed to this sort of thing. And again, like I said, I mean, anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think, we're temperamentally, I'm maybe on the slightly more skeptical side, but I wouldn't go nearly as skeptical as at least some of our commenters here. So I guess I'm in the middle between you and them. But oh well, let's continue on with Cameron.
of limited theism's sheet is being cut away here. Okay, this is the removed portion of limited theism that we're seeing what happens when we add the evidence of order. This piece is being cut away, and this is all that's left down here of limited theism. All right, let's now turn to atheism. So under atheism, why would we expect every particle in the universe to behave in exactly the same way at all times and in all places?
Because there are plausible theories of intrinsic probability from which that follows, because they have coherence as a criterion, and that follows from broader considerations about probabilistic tension and the rationality of induction, etc. So anyway, let's continue on.
Why not just pure chaos? Some atheistic scenarios might even allow for order, but these are very rare exceptions. Most atheistic universes would look completely chaotic, with objects behaving unpredictably or following, and here's a key point here, they might be just following local, inconsistent rules, right? You don't have to have rules that are consistent throughout the universe. You could have local patches of order. So, but let's be generous again.
Which again, you can have in theism, and maybe, I mean, again, for all I know, there can just be local patches of order around the relevant agents so that they can engage in predictable, consistent, repeatable patterns of behavior, and they can be moral agents and whatnot. But elsewhere in the universe, where it's not agent affecting, there's disorder, and maybe that in and of itself can lead to even greater beauty and harmony and so on. Like, who knows? I don't know. These are very difficult things to assess from the armchair.
Yeah, I think in 1 second we're going to see a very silly claim being made.
Rules that are consistent throughout the universe. You could have local patches of order. So, but let's be generous again and assign the probability of order under atheism at 1 in 1,000 or 0.1%. So let's.
What do you think of it? Is that the silly claim that you're talking about?
Okay, wait, I had misremembered what this number was. I mean, I think 1 in 1,000 is very silly, but it's not as silly. It's not as silly as I think some of the other number coming up will be. But
okay. Well, then let's not harp on it then.
Let's go ahead and do that now.
But I mean, I will say, sorry, maybe do a little bit of harping on it.
Okay, fine.
I do think if you think so right now Cameron's treating this as 100 to 1 Bayes factor against atheism, and I don't know. Actually, yeah, I don't have anything that interesting to say other than it just doesn't seem like the laws being consistent throughout the universe. When you have these very plausible accounts of intrinsic probability that render this highly probable, it doesn't seem like this is only 1 in 1,000 odds. I think this is probably more than 50% odds. That I think on atheism, if there are any laws at all, you'd expect them to be uniform throughout the universe.
Yeah, I don't have any rough estimates, but I mean, we've already made the points that we wanted to make about this.
Leaving just a tiny little corner, and actually we can zoom in here and we can see what's going on. Okay, so this is all that's left here. 0.00005% of the entire possibility space is left over. So when we plug these numbers into the software, here's basically what happens. Okay, perfect being theism sheet retains a significant portion of its space, growing in relative size to the others. Limited theism sheet shrinks, but it's still sort of in the running. All right, but then atheism sheet, just with one piece of evidence, is almost entirely cut away, leaving a fraction of its starting probability. So after normalization, that's what this last bar is on the graph here, normalized priors. That's where what's left,
or rather normalized posteriors,
left over after we've cut away the different possibility space, the different sheets of paper. What's left over is then sort of stretched out. It's stretched out over a probability of 1. Okay, and so the leftover probabilities are just sort of stretched out so you can see them. And when we zoom back in here, you can actually see that while atheism is still is very unlikely at this point after just one piece of evidence, it's still there, right? We can still at least see it. So here's what happens to our final probabilities after we have done just included one piece of evidence. All right, perfect being theism is
well, not just one piece of evidence, but one piece of evidence very tendentiously interpreted in terms of its evidential force or evidential strength. And this is like maybe my biggest criticism, one of my biggest criticisms of Cameron's video, which is just that divergent first order assessments of the strength of these pieces of evidence are worth taking seriously and aren't silly. And on those divergent assessments, atheism itself is likewise worth taking seriously and definitely non-silly. And those facts together seem to me to lend a lot of credence to the thought that atheism should not be rendered a silly hypothesis, precisely because there are very serious assessments of the first order evidence, which are worth taking seriously, and on which atheism itself is likewise worth taking seriously. So that whole point is just totally neglected. That just like more meta point about sure, again, like we can always find first order assessments of the evidence which make another hypothesis ludicrously improbable, but we can't then go on to say that that other hypothesis is thereby silly, because alternative assessments of the first order evidence could still be very serious, very live options worth taking seriously, defended by people much more philosophically capable than Cameron, much more informed about these topics than Cameron, etc. And given that those divergent assessments are worth taking seriously, and those divergent assessments render atheism a very live hypothesis, it seems to me that atheism itself is not itself a silly hypothesis, and it's also worth taking seriously. That's like one of the biggest criticisms that I have of the video, and I would assume that you share that criticism.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my biggest criticism of the video is I think the numbers are completely insane. But I also agree with the criticism that, like, yeah, you should take, there are different diverging accounts of the numbers, and even if basically your subjective assessment of them is that they're really high, like, that's not, you should still take a view. A view is not silly because your subjective assessment of it renders the overall Bayes factor, where you plug it into a spreadsheet, high. This is not how you should evaluate the silliness of views. There are lots of very serious views defended by very smart people where, I might think they're implausible, but the views, like, I don't know. It's misleading to call it silly, certainly. And yeah.
Right. So let's continue on.
Now sitting at 83%. Limited theism is now sitting at 16 or 17%, and atheism is like 0.3%. But this step-by-step filtering and rescaling process is actually what makes this software so powerful. It's something I'm so proud of it. I can't tell you guys enough. But it lets you see how the evidence is actually shaping the plausibility of each hypothesis after we add in that evidence. And it's also operating 100% using Bayes' theorem, so you can actually take the calculations in the software to the bank. But real quick, let me address one possible objection in this section, okay?
Before he addresses that objection, here's another thing that I wanted to raise, kind of relating to our previous discussion that we just mentioned. I mean, imagine that we're sort of like there's a court case for a crime. And, there are like, let's say 2 candidate criminals. And there's like, maybe 1 or 2 pieces of evidence that you, as a jury member, think are like close to decisive. Like you think they're just extraordinarily powerful. Like you think the Bayes factor is like 10 to the power of 120 or something. And they just totally swamp the evidence, the other evidence that one could be cited for the other person being guilty. So you side on, person A being guilty as a result of this. And you take person B's guilt by your first order assessment of the evidence. You take it to be like extremely improbable that they're the guilty ones. And instead you think it's extremely probable that person A is the guilty one. But you should still recognize, and let's suppose that this is true of the scenario, that there are lots of other jury members who are equally competent as you. And in fact, some of them may be much more intelligent than you. You have studied the topics far more than you, have written their dissertations on some of these topics, and could, smother you in a debate about them. And who think that the evidence that you think is extraordinarily powerful either isn't evidence at all, maybe isn't data at all, or maybe it just isn't that powerful. And maybe they think that the evidence that you think isn't terribly powerful is actually extremely, extremely powerful. And that leads them to think that actually it's candidate B, which is far more likely to be the guilty person than candidate A, or, person A. In that sort of case, it seems to me that the right epistemic response to this sort of thing is, at the very least, to take the hypothesis that person B committed the crime as a serious hypothesis, and to not say that it's silly. I think that's just like a manifestly true judgment about this particular case. And yet it's exactly what's going on with Cameron's video. Like he's got his particular tendentious first order assessment of a few pieces of evidence, which renders theism far, far, far more probable, according to his numbers, than atheism. But again, there are other jury members, as it were, many of whom are far more competent than Cameron and far more philosophically adept, and who have written on these topics, and who either say that these pieces of evidence that he's adducing, particularly with fine-tuning, either actually aren't part of our data at all. There are philosophers and physicists who argue that, or while it is part of our data, it's either it's just not as strong as evidence as Cameron thinks. And then still other jury members who think that the evidence against theism is far more cogent, powerful than Cameron thinks. And in that case, it seems to me that just as in the jury case, like Cameron should still be thinking that atheism is a serious hypothesis worth taking seriously. I don't see a relevant disanalogy between the cases. So my argument there against Cameron would be in the jury case, even given your tendentious first order assessment of the evidence, you should still take the hypothesis that person B committed the crime seriously. You should regard that as a non-silly hypothesis. Premise 2, if that's the case, well then, even given Cameron's tendentious assessment of the first order evidence, he should still take atheism seriously. It should not be regarded as a silly hypothesis. And so the conclusion follows logically and inescapably, as Professor William Lane Craig says.
And inescapably.
Yes, exactly. Spaceless, timeless.
Yeah. If jury members can come to a agreement, why not Beethoven and root beer?
Bicycles.
Yeah. I am in agreement. I think normally when you have an argument where you're confident of a view with more than like 99% certainty, you should think it's way more likely that your argument went wrong somewhere than that, like, conditional on you being wrong. The most of that probability mass should be on cases where the argument is wrong somewhere, rather than the less than 1% of probability space where conditional on the argument being right, the view turns out wrong. Like, there have been all sorts. There was a young Earth creationist who calculated the odds of life forming by chance and got it as like 1 in 10 to the 3,000th power. And I mean, so first of all, of course, the calculations were wrong, but also just like, even if the young Earth creationists couldn't spot the calculation, what was wrong with the calculations, they should think it's way more likely that the calculations were wrong than that life formed by chance, despite having 1 in 10 to the 3,000th odds. You should almost always think it's more likely that your argument that establishes that your conclusion is near certain is wrong than that it's right and the other conclusion just turns out to be correct by chance.
All right, back to the video.
Some atheists might argue that there are possible atheistic scenarios that predict order, like a multiverse or some kind of like self-organizing principle in nature. And that's totally fair enough. But here's my response to that. Just because there are scenarios that are...
Can others? I don't know.
What'd you say?
I can't see the video. I don't know if other people can. Okay, now I can.
Nature. And that's totally fair enough. But here's my response to that. Just because there are scenarios that are possible under atheism, that doesn't make them likely under atheism. So under atheism, these scenarios occupy only a tiny sliver of the overall possibility space. The vast majority of atheistic possibilities, on that sheet of paper predict disorder, are comprised of disorder and chaos, not the stunning universal regularity that we observe in this universe, where the laws are universal, they're not local, they're throughout the whole universe. So even if we grant that such scenarios are possible under atheism, where there are possible sort of possibilities under atheism where there is order, that doesn't change the fact that order is overwhelmingly improbable on atheism or given atheism or under atheism. That's why the numbers that we've assigned here, where atheism accounts for less than 1%, still holds up.
Okay, so a lot of mistakes are being made here. The first thing I want to say is like, well, why are those hypotheses super improbable under atheism? I mean, he said they only take up like a tiny sliver of atheism's probability space. Why? I mean, at least some of these hypotheses are actually pretty elegant, and at least certain philosophical models of them make the existence of a variety of universes simply follow from a single, very simple plenitudinous principle. So it's actually not very clear why such views would be like drastically improbable under atheism. But that's the first point, and the more minor point. The more major point here, the more major problem here is that even if these hypotheses initially take up a tiny section of atheism's probability space, they're going to get confirmed by the data that they predict pretty well, such as these various pieces of data that Cameron is considering, like fine-tuning and order, etc., right? In which case, this part of atheism's probability space should be growing. And moreover, as we pointed out earlier, this will then influence atheism's predictions later on when we go to evaluate how other pieces of evidence are predicted, how well they're predicted under atheism and theism. Because again, like if these various multiverse hypotheses initially take up a tiny sliver of atheism's probability space, but they predict the data really well, and all the other atheistic probability space predicts the data terribly, then once you update on that piece of evidence, those other portions of atheism's probability space are going to be very, very tiny compared to this very large portion of atheism's probability space, which is now taken up by the multiverse hypothesis, which predicts the data. And so then going forward, this is how atheism is going to be generating most of its predictions. It's going to then be based on the multiverse models of atheism. It's that atheism is then going to be mostly multiverse atheism. And then that view can then be significantly confirmed by considerations pertaining to, let's say, fine-tuning, etc. And then we no longer get Cameron's sort of reasoning that atheism is silly. And this really does ultimately just completely screw up his probabilistic calculations for why atheism is silly, which is another, I think, one of the biggest problems in his video. I don't know if you'd agree with that. There's another one of the central problems with this video.
Yep. Nothing to add there.
Okay. Okay. Well then, oh yes, debate Jay Dyer. I get these comments every single video. I guess I can finally address it here. Listen, I have seen certain videos of Jay Dyer and things that he's posted on social media, and I am not into the tribalism that I have seen exhibited from him and his communities. That is what I'm going to say. I'm not saying that that's what he always does. It's just given my experience of what I've looked at with respect to him. I'm not interested in that more tribalistic modus operandi. And that's the reason why I would not. Actually, there are many more reasons. Like almost every single competent philosopher of religion, I don't take transcendental arguments and all that stuff even seriously. So
yeah, no doubt one of the reasons is fear. You're afraid,
right? Oh yeah, I'm afraid of the towering intellects of the transcendental argument proponents, almost none of which are professional philosophers, and they're like
you'll be exposed as living in a chance worldview with no ultimate foundation for what is possible and impossible. Yeah, I watched, so Jay Dyer had a debate with Trent Horn about whether natural theology was legitimate. And I mean, it was just hilarious where, like, Trent Horn is a good debater. He had his opening statement that was very well polished. He went through some arguments for natural theology. He quoted scripture, he did normal things. And then Jay Dyer's opening statement was just 15 minutes of completely incomprehensible gibberish. Jimmy Akin in a post-debate review compared it trying to figure out what was going on in that to trying to drink from a fire hose, where maybe you get a little bit, you get small dashes, but really you're missing nearly all of it. And it wasn't structured like an argument. He was just name dropping problems.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. He's just name drops problems, and he also misused them. And he's just name dropping these things like rigid designators, plastic designators, without defining them for the audience, just to seemingly just kind of. Well, I'm not gonna speculate on motives, but the effect is that the untutored listener will think, "Wow, this guy really knows his stuff," because he's dropping all these crazy technical terms without defining them and so on. And so the effect on the untutored listener is to be wow at the intellect, whereas the tutored listener who has actually read his Kripke and knows what a rigid designator and flaccid designator and these various things are, we can see through a lot of this, and we see misuses of various technical notions. So anyway, I'm not going to get into this. All the people who are commenting debate Jay Dyer, you guys can stop. I've now given you my justification.
I will say, if you debated Jay Dyer, that would be very funny. That it would definitely rack up the lulls. But
right, yes. I mean, I've learned how painful some of these sorts of debates with tribalistic individuals can be. Everyone just search up "Curb Your Polemics," Joe Schmid, Canadian Catholic.
Yeah, that was really funny. Also, your convo with T-Jump was also very funny.
Yeah, no, we don't talk about that. That's psychologically scarring. Oh, that's a good question. Dog's Domain. Liverpool is beating Arsenal to the title. We don't need to remind me of that, okay? We're supposed to be happy now. We're not supposed to be talking about Arsenal's imploding season. Okay. Let's get back to Cameron.
Remember, this is just one piece of evidence. Okay, we have We haven't even gotten to like the big daddy. All right. Now let's see what happens when we add in the next piece of evidence. Let's move on to fine tuning. First, what do we mean by fine tuning? Well, it's the idea that the fundamental constants of nature, the numbers baked into the laws of physics. So even if you've got laws, if you've got universal regularity, these are the constants of nature, the numbers that are in there. And these numbers fall within an extraordinarily narrow range that makes life possible. So for example, gravity is strong enough to hold planets together, but it's not so strong that stars are going to collapse in on themselves, right? You've got the right number in that gravitational constant. The same goes for countless other constants like the cosmological constant, which governs the expansion of the universe. And here's what's important here, though. The numbers that we see in these constants, they didn't have to fall into life.
I was talking to Aaron Wall recently, who's a physicist, and he thinks the fine-tuning argument is a good argument, but he doesn't think that the fine-tuning argument from gravity is any good. I think it's hard to remember the exact explanation, but I think that the explanation of why fine-tuning, of like why gravity takes on the force that it does, is explained by deeper physics, such that the kind of like, just assign an inference principle across the orders of magnitude that span the four fundamental forces is unreasonable. But yeah, definitely the cosmological constant is an impressive kind of fine-tuning. And there are certainly other impressive kinds. But I think like there are some kinds that aren't actually impressive, but that just catch on among apologists. And my sense is that the fine-tuning for gravity is that way. And I think I've heard Robin Collins say similar things.
The same goes for countless other constants like the cosmological constant, which governs the expansion of the universe. And here's what's important here, though. The numbers that we see in these constants, they didn't have to fall into life-permitting ranges. And in fact, they're so precise that changing just one constant by even a fraction could render the entire universe lifeless. Let's quantify this with an example. Dr. Luke Barnes, a cosmologist, has calculated that the odds of getting the right value for the cosmological constant are 1 in 10 to the 90th. 1 in 10 to the 90th. I don't know why I'm doing this. That's a decimal. Okay, if you don't know the math here, that's a decimal followed by 90 zeros before you hit a 1. To put that into perspective, that would be like basically randomly picking one specific atom out of the entire observable universe and somehow...
Hold on. What did you
10
say?
to the 90th. I don't know why I'm doing this. Constant. A 1 in 10 to the 90th. 1 in 10 to the 90th. I don't know why I'm doing this. That's a decimal. Okay, if you don't know the math here, that's a decimal followed by 90 zeros.
No, it's followed by 89 zeros. 10
Wow.
to 1 times 10 to the negative 1 is 0.1, right? So that's not followed by 1 0. It's 0 zeros. What's 10 to the negative 2 is 0.01, so there's only 1 0. So it's
Yeah, I missed that.
zeros.
Wow, his entire Cameron's been owned. His entire video was copyrighted.
Right.
Yeah, he should
Now-
retire.
Now is the time that we just... Anyway, well, let's move on.
Before you hit a 1. To put that into perspective, that would be like basically randomly picking one specific atom out of the entire observable universe and somehow picking the right one. That's the probability that we're talking about here by chance. Okay, and according to Barnes, when you combine all of the known fine-tuned constants, the odds drop to, here it is, 1 in 10 to the 136. At this point, these sorts of numbers are so small, it's almost impossible to imagine. All right, let's go ahead and add fine-tuning as another piece of evidence. Let's add it here. We'll write it in, fine-tuning. All right, so now we're ready to evaluate under our different hypotheses. So first of all, perfect being theism. A perfect being wouldn't necessarily have to create a life-permitting orderly universe. He could create something else like an orderly realm filled with angels. But it's pretty plausible that a perfect being might value a universe capable of sustaining life as a sort of consequence of his laws, maybe as a reflection of his creativity and his goodness. But let's be, again, conservative and assign this a relatively low probability of 1 in 1,000, or again, 0.1%.
So, I mean, it is worth noting that, like, I at least think that there are objections to the fine-tuning argument worth taking seriously that are not silly, on which the probability that the constants would fall within the narrow biological life-permitting range conditional on theism is just as small as on indifference naturalism. I think there are non-silly objections to that effect. These objections would come by way of things like Neil Sinababu's Electrons in Love paper in American Philosophical Quarterly. I think that's from 2017. As well as, maybe with some touch-ups, Neil Manson's paper, How Not to Be Generous to Fine-Tuning Skeptics. And the basic idea there is that And I mean, I know, Matthew, you and I have talked about this, and actually we're probably very much likely going to be writing a paper on this and getting to the bottom of this, whether or not we agree or disagree about the electrons in love style objections. So audience, stay tuned. My own views have been somewhat in flux about this, but like I still do think that they're worth taking seriously, and that's the only bar that I need to meet here. And the basic idea is that, I mean, given any way that the constants fell under theism, if they fell within the narrow biological life permitting range or even outside the narrow biological life permitting range, God still would have been able to secure what he was aiming at in creating embodied conscious creatures, namely, like the values of moral agency, the values of just, embodied creatures capable, embodied conscious creatures capable of engaging in relationships with one another, engaging in relationships with God, building moral character, etc. And so then, given that God could have achieved such beings, given any way that the constants within the laws of nature fell, whether they fall within the narrow life permitting range or any other values outside the narrow life permitting range, and given that there doesn't seem to be any particular reason on theism to expect God to prefer values within the narrow biological life permitting range as opposed to values of the constants that fall outside of them, then under theism we should just be indifferent. We should assign basically a flat probability distribution to each of the relevant values that the constants could take on. Now, why is that claim? Why do these people think that crucial claim is true, that God still could have achieved conscious embodied moral agents under even values of the constants that fall outside the narrow biological life permitting range? Well, there are a few ways that God could do that for any such values. He could just tweak, for instance, the psychophysical laws, the laws that pair mental states with physical states, and instead of pairing mental states with the physical states of like biological organisms, and in particular their neural states, God could have made, for instance, electron states pair with very complex mental states, so that when electrons are a certain distance from one another, they engage in heartfelt communication. When they emit certain bursts, they are singing praises to God mentally. That's what the psychophysical laws pair. Another way that God could do it is that even if God had created the constants so that they were not naturally biological life permitting, God could still miraculously sustain biological life in any conditions whatsoever, no matter what the initial constants took on, or the constants in the laws of nature. So again, I'm not saying that this objection here succeeds. My point is that very capable philosophers have published in very top venues developing these objections in quite sophisticated ways. And I think that they're at least worth taking seriously. And if they are, then they completely zap theism of its ability to get, the 10 to the power of 136 or whatever Bayes factor here. Because again, the fact that the constants fall within the narrow biological life permitting range are going to be equally surprising on theism as on an indifference style naturalism. So again, I'm not saying that these objections here succeed. And again, you guys are probably going to be hearing in maybe a year from now whether or not I think that they succeed, because Matthew and I are going to be co-authoring a paper on this very objection. But I still do think they're worth taking seriously, even if they don't succeed.
Yeah, I agree they're worth taking seriously. I mean, I guess maybe I'll just state sort of briefly my thoughts on these, which is, first of all, I think there's a decent probability that God would create tons of different things. And so the odds that at least some of the things he creates would be universes that have the values of life, that have the values of our constants, are not that low. And second, I think that even if he didn't make a bunch of different ones, the odds aren't that low that he would make that he would set the parameters to this value. Like, I think basically there are kind of like three broad ways of God producing embodied conscious agents, given our laws, which are first to finely tune the constants, second to create them by miracle, and third to create them via exotic psychophysical laws. And I think you should think the odds that he'd create them by finely tuning the parameters so that the laws naturally produce complex structures. I think you should think the odds aren't that low. Certainly, I don't think you should think the odds are low on the order of 1 in 10 to the negative 136, right? So let's just get clear on how low the probability is. the probability of that is lower than the probability that next second I'll be sucked into the air by a tornado. Then after I, exit the tornado, the next second after that be struck by a meteorite. Then the second after that be blown up by a terrorist. And then my family will buy 2 Powerball tickets and win the lottery twice. Like, I think the odds that God would want to make finely tuned, that God would want to make the constants naturally produce complex structures by fine tuning them is much higher than the odds of all those events. And by the way, all those events only get you to like 10 to the negative 60, right? So it would be like all those events happening twice immediately, the second after each other. So I guess those are kind of my thoughts. But what I do think that the electrons and love argument is more successful at doing, I find it very implausible if the idea is just like the odds of fine tuning are just as low on atheism as atheism. I think what it's most successful at, the way it's most successful is if you can join it with some naturalistic account of fine tuning, right? So if you combine a multiverse where you say the odds of fine tuning given a multiverse aren't that low, and then you combine it with the electrons and love objection, and you say, and the odds given theism are decently low, then together these have a cumulative effect where they make it so that, one is sort of playing offense, we're saying the odds are low on theism, and the other is playing defense, we're saying the odds aren't that low on naturalism. I think basically if the odds on naturalism are like on the order of 1 in Google, I think that naturalism is doomed. But if you can tell a plausible story of how you get these things on naturalism, then I don't think naturalism is doomed. I mean, I guess the other point is regarding Cameron's numbers, just if you have uncertainty about which are the right numbers to assign, then basically the numbers that round down to 0 will wash out, and then you'll probably get numbers that are more like Cameron's.
Right. Well, we've been back and forth on these.
Yeah.
We're not going to bore the audience with anyway.
Yeah.
And so in this case, most of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut away, 0.001. All right. Next, limited theism. So a limited deity might lack the power to fine tune a universe to this degree. All right. He just might not have enough power, or he might have it. He might have that power and just not value it as much as an even greater genius might value it. It's far less likely that a being with limited abilities could or would produce a life-permitting universe, but still it's not fantastically implausible. We're limited beings and we fine tune things all the time when we have a chance. So let's set this probability at 1 in 1 million. All right. We're going to go with a relatively low number here. So 1 in.
What is good? What? That number is insane. What? I mean, first of all, like 1 in you think the odds that if there was a limited deity of some sort, that they would make, that they would create a universe that has finely tuned constants are 1 in a million? Like these just seem like ludicrous numbers. I mean, like there are lots. Like, okay, so what are the odds that a limited being would create life? Like, I don't know, but they're not that low. And then if they create life, well, they might create life by just like direct miracle, but maybe they can't do that. The odds aren't that low that they would have to make it through some like physical system. And if they make it through a physical system, that would just inevitably involve like or at least the odds aren't that low that would involve having finely tuned constants. So I mean, just the 1 in a million number just strikes me as insane. Like,
I hardly even know how to put a number here, because again, limited theism is just a ginormous disjunction of infinitely many more specific limited God hypotheses. Some of them are like, God just wants to create cheese. Okay, another one is like God just wants to create cheese and pebbles. Another one is like God just wants to, God wants to create life. Another one is like, and they vary in so many different respects. Some of them vary God's power, other than vary God's goodness. Some of them are even like maximally evil gods. Others, they vary God's knowledge. And they differ in the desires that they posit of this being. It's like, I'm at a loss for what number that, even like a range.
Yeah. I mean, the point is, if you're just assigning a single number and you're at a loss, then you should be conservative, right? If you're like, I don't know what the number is, maybe it's super low, maybe it's super high, then your average should be a middling number. You shouldn't be like, well, I don't know what it is, so I'm going to say 1 in a million.
Well, I don't think it would be. Well, I don't think it would be super high, but anyway.
Yeah.
Let's continue on
no,
with the video, because we're nitpicking a lot.
Yeah. 1 million.
1 in a million is insane.
0.000001.
Oh, hold on. How many zeros were there?
low number here. So 1 in 1 million. Let's type that in. 0.0000001. Okay, so atheism is
that
looking
one in
pretty
a
good
million?
here.
I'd have to write that
We
up.
start talking about how
Not sure if
likely
that's one in a
fine-tuning
million.
is on atheism. All right, so here's where things get ridiculous. All right, on atheism, there is no guiding intelligence. It's all pure dumb luck. All right.
If you have 1 in a million, that needs to be 5 zeros again, because that's, 1 in 10 to the 6. So that's, 1 times 10 to the negative 6. So there should be 5. Did he put? I think he put 6 zeros.
0.0000001.
Yeah, so that's 10 million.
Okay, so atheism is looking pretty good here. And we start talking about how likely fine-tuning is on atheism. All right, so here's where things get ridiculous. All right, on atheism, there is no guiding intelligence. It's all pure dumb luck. All right.
On indifference naturalism, but again, this is what's happening when you ignore value selection atheistic hypotheses, and those would be taking up a huge portion of atheism's probability space given your previous update. So like, atheism would then be, its predictions would be predominated by the value selection hypotheses. Again, going along with Cameron's own sort of thing. So like, actually, no, you wouldn't be able to plug in this ludicrously low number. So the whole methodology here is just bunk. It's complete bunk.
Yeah,
same with the multiverse point. Again, like we don't even have to put this in terms of value selection. Like we made the same point about the multiverse in the previous thing, and multiverse arguably predicts the data here.
I'm more sympathetic to the methodology, at least as sort of like a rough guide. Like, if we're trying to decide between two views, this is one of the things you can do to think through the views. But if you're going to do it, you should assign the numbers in like a not crazy way. And you shouldn't assign the numbers in a way that basically only a person really confident on your view would ever agree with. Like you should try to assign the numbers in like reasonable ways where you don't count things as, 1,000,000 updates or something in favor of hypotheses for bad reasons.
Well, listen, when you say that the methodology, I mean, we're in agreement that like these toy Bayesian models can be helpful, but the methodology that I was specifically pointing at was the one where he's ignoring that most of, given the previous update, most of atheism's probability space at this stage should be taken up by like value selection atheistic hypotheses and like multiverse.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood what you're saying.
Yeah, and he's completely neglected that, and it would affect how probable the data here is, and it wouldn't be that ludicrously improbable as he's going to be saying it. In fact, it would probably be evidence for atheism at this point. So I just think that aspect of the methodology here is just bunk.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's continue.
Right, the odds of hitting a life-permitting universe by chance are astronomical. We've already talked about it, but let's be very generous to the atheists. There's a point why I'm doing this actually, because it's going to break my software if I actually put in the right numbers. But let's be generous and say that it's 1 in a trillion or 1 in 10 to the 12th power. All right, so even though it's wildly optimistic compared to the real number that Luke Barnes has calculated, let's go ahead and plug that in here. So 0.00000000001.
That's one too many zeros.
Ooh, okay. So
okay,
when we plug these numbers,
there's something very funny about it. Okay, let's be really generous to the atheist. And then the numbers he comes up with are 1 in a trillion. Like, what? This does not sound like a very generous number. Particularly, so I agree that if you just have a single universe naturalism, I think probably the right first order theory of how to assign probabilities will score the result that the odds of fine-tuning are like much less than that. But you shouldn't have a credence of 1 in single universe naturalism. You shouldn't have a credence of 1 in you being right about the first order theory, right? So maybe there are exotic ways of assigning, the odds are well above 1 in a trillion that I'm just deeply confused about how to assign priors, and that this whole enterprise is bunk. And then the best atheistic explanations of fine-tuning are not going to be, we just, hit the constants by pure blind luck. The best atheistic explanations of fine-tuning are going to be, I think the best one is going to be a multiverse. I think a multiverse conditional on atheism and orderly laws obviously has odds of well above 1 in a trillion. And there are these other atheistic hypotheses. So take axiarchism, for example. So the axiarchism is the idea that the fact that something is good explains why it happens. So that which would be fortunate is what happens. Then there are different variations of exactly how axiarchism works. Now, so long as you have a credence of more than like 1 in a billion in axiarchism, well, now axiarchism, if you accept his previous statement, is just, is taking up a sizable portion of the atheistic probability space. But it makes basically the same predictions as theism. So axiarchism, like, should have a decent share of the probability space. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, it's just such a ludicrous claim that the right numbers being conservative are 1 in a trillion. And the reason he was saying it was conservative was it's like, well, the numbers that come from Barnes are even lower. But the numbers that come from Barnes are what happens if you have single universe naturalism and you assign basically a principle of indifference or a log prior across the values of the constants. But obviously, the best naturalistic explanation of fine-tuning is going to have a prior much higher than just getting these things by chance. So, I mean, it's just very silly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I pinned a comment earlier from Nathan where he said something along the lines of, keep in mind that also this is after we've kind of updated on order. So like order should be in the background. And it's very hard to tell how probable that the values of the constants of the laws of nature would fall within the narrow life permitting range, given that we have an orderly, kind of orderly cosmos where things kind of behave in regular law governed ways, and where those laws apply uniformly throughout, etc. It seems like it should like affect the probability, and that again seems to be elided in Cameron's analysis. So it's another significant limitation of Cameron's analysis, it seems to me. And
yeah, that's right, and that's especially right given that Cameron's view of order is that order is wildly surprising given atheism. It's the sort of thing that demands like very stringent explanation and is wildly surprising. So once you think, okay, something wildly surprising is happening on atheism and explaining order. Well, now a lot of these exotic atheistic hypotheses other than bare naturalism, if you buy his analysis about order being ludicrously surprising, now these are a lot of the atheism probability space. But then these are going to explain fine-tuning roughly as well as theism does.
Okay, let's continue.
Into the software. It rules out nearly all of atheism's possibility space and a significant chunk of limited theism's space. And what's left is that perfect being theism comes out way ahead. You know what? Let's go ahead and just zoom in here, see if we can even see the possibility space or the probability of atheism. Let's just try to zoom in, see if we can even see this. And we got to zoom in a lot.
Wow, you have to zoom in so far.
Keep going. Oh, there it is. There's atheism. We have to zoom in a lot, but we see it.
Important insights, like if you take some view that you have low credence in, and then you knock out 999 billion, 999 million, 900, etc., of the trillion of its remaining probability space, then its remaining share of the probability space is small. This is a shocking insight that we need in the software to illustrate.
Right, as someone in the chat is saying, you multiply a number by almost 0 and you get almost 0.
Yeah, what mathematicians?
Right, and you do so. Why is atheism taking up such a low portion of your probability space? Well, because you have a demonstrably flawed methodology, as we've explained.
My software is even just registering it as like a 0 probability at this point, but it's not completely 0. Okay. Actually, if we look here, we should be able to see the final probabilities, the final posterior probabilities here. Okay. So it's using scientific notation. So it's non-zero, guys. Atheism is still, it's still there. There's still a chance that atheism is true. So it's not completely out of the running. So that's good. So after fine tuning, the updated probabilities look like this. So perfect being theism, my software is rounding it up to 1. Limited theism is, sort of a tiny fraction, and atheism is virtually non-existent. And here's the wild part, guys. Okay, this isn't even using the real fine tuning numbers like 1 in 10 to the 136. If we use the real numbers, atheism slice would disappear almost entirely. Again, it wouldn't be 0, but it would be very, 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 very low. You wouldn't even.
Right. So when we're criticizing theism, right, we got to be super careful to distinguish between like limited theism and omnitheism, right? And like, hey, your arguments are only targeting omnitheism, right? Oh, but when we're challenging atheism, let's treat its predictions as just in single universe indifferent naturalism. I sense a double standard.
Yep.
See it on the graph, like it would break my software. All right, let's now add one more crucial clue to the mix. Before we get to the problem of evil, let's turn now to consciousness. So for clarity, when I say consciousness, I'm specifically talking about conscious creatures, created beings that have mental states, beings like us who can think and feel and reflect on the world around us. Here's the question, though.
And who can touch your mother?
Given the orderly and fine-tuned universe we've already established as background knowledge, how likely is it that conscious creatures would exist under each of our three hypotheses? Let's go back to my software and add in our third piece of evidence. This one is, again, consciousness. We'll type it out really quickly. All right, so starting with perfect being theism, if a perfect being exists, it wouldn't be too surprising to find that this being has created conscious creatures. Why? Well, first of all, a perfect being would recognize the intrinsic value of consciousness. Consciousness is pretty valuable.
So would a value selection, atheistic hypothesis, etc.
Consciousness enables rational thought. It enables love, creativity, moral understanding, and good, deep relationships, all of which align with a perfect creator's values. Since we've already established an orderly fine-tuned universe in our background knowledge, the existence of conscious creatures fits really naturally, actually, on a perfect being hypothesis. But let's conservatively assign this a probability of 50%, so 0.5. See what happens. Let's turn now to limited theism. All right, so
I've been being mean to Cameron for a lot of his numbers. I think this is a good number. This seems maybe low, but this seems like for one of the, this actually seems like, a decent conservative number. So kudos.
Yeah, I don't know. Let's continue.
Under limited theism, a conscious deity might also value creating conscious creatures. After all, relationships with other conscious beings are highly meaningful, and even we, as limited beings, create conscious creatures all the time when we have humans create families and stuff. But consciousness is also incredibly complex and difficult to explain. If you've ever thought about it for any amount of time, a limited deity might lack the power or understanding to create consciousness, even in an orderly, fine-tuned universe. While many conceivable limited beings could potentially create consciousness, the challenge of consciousness makes this significantly less likely than under perfect being theism. So let's assign this a probability of just 1% or 0.01.
Seems way
now,
too
under
low.
atheism, consciousness is wildly unexpected. I can't sugarcoat this at all. In a universe that's already orderly and fine-tuned, life itself is still a staggering rarity. Okay, the odds of randomly assembling the right conditions for even the simplest forms of life are astronomically low. But even if life somehow emerges on atheism, this leap to consciousness is
So, like, I get the intuitive attraction of that thought. But I feel like I want maybe like a little bit something more stable under my feet to stand on, Like, I don't know, like our judgments about probabilities from the armchair, especially like given we're having to assess these things given a fine-tuned universe and given order. What then is the probability that conscious life would come about? I don't know. I haven't worked through the different life permitting values and which of them like evolves the universe forward in ways that lead to conscious embodied creatures. Again, this just seems so flimsy. Like I share the intuition from the armchair that, yeah, it seems like, it seems like it'd be hard to make consciousness, even given fine tuning. But like, why should I put much stock in that? I don't know. I want to see something more. I want something more robust than just this kind of intuitive reaction from the armchair in a domain where, given that this is about like very complicated scientific matters about what happens within the various finely tuned universes, given that I really don't see why, my intuitions about this matter specifically should be all too reliable.
I guess. Yeah, I don't think so. The thing Cameron emphasizes is like, it's so unlikely life would evolve and go through the many steps needed to get conscious creatures. I don't find that very surprising. I guess I don't know exactly how improbable it is, but there are some steps that seem at least somewhat improbable. But the universe, here's a shocking fact that will blow your mind. The universe is really big. It's potentially infinite in size. So given this, it's not that unlikely that like somewhere in the universe, life would arise and would go through the steps necessary to give rise give rise to sort of complex creatures. Now, the thing that does strike me as surprising is that there are certain physical structures that give rise to consciousness. So I find this especially surprising because I'm a dualist. So I think it requires special psychophysical laws, these extra laws that give rise to consciousness. But even if you're a physicalist, you'll think that, unless you're a type A physicalist, you'll think that consciousness it's necessary that physical states give rise to consciousness, but something can be necessary on a theory and still be surprising if you wouldn't expect it in advance, right? So like, the theory that said, you go to Vegas and you get 10 royal flushes. The theory that says, oh, it's just necessary, determinism's true, and it's physically necessary that I get 10 royal flushes, is not a good explanation of it, because you wouldn't expect in advance to get 10 royal flushes, so it's still sort of surprising in that sense. And so I do think consciousness is some evidence against atheism, and I do think it's decent evidence, but especially if you have my sort of my philosophical views on other issues, like thinking that consciousness is non-physical. But you shouldn't be supremely confident in dualism, for instance, given that it's this contentious view. So it won't be good for any insanely high Bayes factor. So in other words, Cameron appeals to two things. One of them is that the stage is needed for in life to get life happen. And that I don't find very surprising once you have fine tuning in the background. And then once you have life getting consciousness, I don't find it. I think that's a little decently surprising, but not surprising on the level that he's gonna describe it as surprising when he.
Yeah, I mean, and we should also again keep in mind that arguably from the two preceding pieces of evidence, various atheistic multiverse hypotheses will be taking up a pretty large fraction of the atheistic probability space, and just the very fact that there's a multiverse arguably makes it, it does make it much more probable that, consciousness would arise somewhere or other. Creaturely consciousness would arise somewhere or other in this ginormous, vast, perhaps even plenitudinous multiverse. So that's another thing to keep in mind, which would make atheism actually predict this data actually decently well.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
It depends on the multiverse model, because if you are a dualist, then I think it'll be surprising that the multiverse that varies the physical laws also varies the psychophysical laws. So I think it'll still end up being surprising on the multiverse share of probability space. But I mean, if you think both order and fine tuning are monstrously improbable, then a decent share of your probability space should be, after knocking out nearly all of atheism, on these value selection hypotheses like axiarchism, like natural teleology, and then these will just predict consciousness with decently high probability. So once you count the first few bits of evidence as insanely strong, then you have to stop counting the later bits of evidence as insanely strong, because the things that explain the first several extremely surprising things have a not terrible odds of explaining the next thing that you would in a vacuum find very surprising.
Assign this a probability of just 1% or 0.01. Now, under atheism, consciousness is wildly unexpected. I can't sugarcoat this at all. In a universe that's already orderly and fine-tuned, life itself is still astronomically low. But even if life somehow emerges on atheism, this leap to consciousness is an entirely different level of improbability. Consciousness introduces something radically new, subjective experience. Unlike physical properties like mass or charge, which are publicly accessible and measurable, consciousness gives its subject privileged access to mental states. So for example, only you know that you're in pain. Your awareness of it is fundamentally different from any external observation. This sudden emergence of a property.
I mean, it's not true that only I know that I'm in pain. My mom knows when I'm in pain, for instance. I know what he's trying to say. I have a kind of distinctive access to my pain that my mom doesn't have. My mom has to kind of use my outward bodily signs, my wailing, my signaling for my blankie. She has to use those signs as inferring that I'm in pain or something. Whereas I am just sort of directly aware of it. So I have a kind of more secure access, and I have a kind of direct awareness of it that my mom doesn't have. But like, still, it's a mistake to say that only I know.
Our awareness of it is fundamentally different from any external observation.
Yeah.
This like
I will
sudden
say,
emerge.
I actually like. I agree with the core insight of Cameron that just like on naturalism, I think consciousness is very surprising. Where it's just everything else in the world on naturalism is this like stuff that's exhaustively describable in terms of its structure and function, and then consciousness is about this sort of rich, private, qualitative inner life that doesn't even in principle reduce to the other stuff. At least I claim. Of course, people are going to disagree with that. Yeah, so like I'm in agreement with Cameron here that consciousness is a good argument for theism. Now, how good of an argument remains to be seen, and I don't think it's anywhere near as good as Cameron apparently does.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually largely agree with that assessment. I don't think it's nearly as powerful as Cameron does, but ultimately, I also probably think that it's some evidence for theism, at least if we go with type B physicalism or dualism. So given those, I would grant that it's evidence
or panpsychism or idealism, like any view other than type A physicalism, I assume.
Yeah. Good
Okay.
Good clarification.
Of a property so unlike everything else in a physical universe is deeply puzzling under atheism. Why would blind, unguided processes produce beings capable of self-awareness, rational thought, and moral understanding? In a godless universe, consciousness isn't just a fluke, it's a fluke of a fluke, layered on top of the already improbable emergence of life. Even being generous,
right, but we've already conditioned, we've already put in our background that there's a fine-tuned universe which allows for life to develop. Now, again, allowing for life to develop does not guarantee that it develops. So maybe there's some sort of probabilistic barrier there, but at least significantly raises the probability of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're having in the background with fine-tuning is just that, like, what generally it's that the constants fall in a narrow range where like any complex structures can form, but or you can where you could even in principle get anything that looks remotely lifelike. But like once you have that, it's not that unlikely that life forms in a really big universe. And it's not that unlikely that the universe is big given naturalism.
Yeah.
Probability of consciousness arising under atheism is vanishingly, that's what I meant to say, vanishingly small. But let's set it at 1 in a million. All right, let's be generous here. So 0.0000001.
Let's be generous.
That's one too. First, it had one too many zeros. That was 1 in 10 million. But also, I mean, again, we've given our reasons why we think that that's.
He had to add the extra zero because he was being too generous.
Right. Yeah.
Plug these numbers into the software. Perfect being theism retains a significant portion. Limited theism loses most of its space again. But after, let's just look at the probabilities. Okay. So again, it's sort of rounding up to 1 for perfect being theism. Limited theism, barely there. Atheism, man, it's sad. It's very sad. All right, we've covered order, fine-tuning, and consciousness.
Pause for a second. So let's just see one way to see that this goes wrong. Okay, let's imagine you think you have a prior of 1 in a million in axiarchism, and think that the odds are 1 in a million that conditional on axiarchism. You'd get the 3 things: order, fine-tuning, and consciousness. Both of these seem like considerable underestimates. If you have that, then you'll get the probability of atheism way higher than he has it, even if you ignore literally 100% of the rest of the atheistic probability space. In fact, the overall probability of axiarchism, given the evidence, is lower than he thinks the ratio of all the atheistic hypotheses is to all the theistic hypotheses. I mean, it's very silly. Something has gone badly wrong when you think that the odds of a view is on the order of 1 in 10 to the negative 20th after only considering 3 pieces of evidence.
Yeah, and I mean, we're also just like completely taking out of the picture like higher order uncertainty, like uncertainty about this being the right method for going about doing philosophy, uncertainty about your ability, your competence about these things, uncertainty deriving from the fact that epistemic superiors of you disagree with your numbers assigned and disagree that this is the right sort of methodology to approach these issues with, higher order uncertainty deriving from all sorts of different things, which would then considerably open up the door to these alternative hypotheses being taken seriously, at least in my view.
Yeah. Let's see. So Cameron thinks that the odds conditional on atheism of the three pieces of evidence are 1 in a million multiplied by 1 in a trillion multiplied by 1 in 1,000. So it's like 1 in a billion times 1 in a 1 in a billion times 1 in a trillion, I think. So let's see, what is that? 1 over 1 billion times 1 over 1 trillion. Okay, so
Just
in total,
add 9 zeros to 6 zeros. It's 10 to 15.
No, wait, I think okay. When I typed in 1 over a billion times 1 over a trillion, into Google, it said 1 over 10 to the negative 21st.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's probably right.
Yeah. But like, sorry, you just should think that the odds, like there's so many atheistic explanations that can okay, here's one. There's a multiverse and it has laws that differ throughout the multiverse, including psychophysical laws that differ throughout the multiverse. Okay. And it's this sort of simple set of multiversal laws. Okay. Yeah. I don't know exactly how likely this is, but like, which is likelier, that that's true or that you're going to win the lottery twice in a row and then get struck by a hurricane or something? Like, surely that has a much higher prior than 1 in negative 10 to the 1 in 10 to the negative 21st or something.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, earlier I was multiplying 1 in a million times 1 in a billion, which is 10 to the 6th, or 1 in 10 to the 6th times 1 in 10 to the 9. Whereas I should have been doing a billion and a trillion, right? Which is 1 in 10 to the 9 times 1 in 10 to the 12, which is 1 in 10 to the 21, right? So that's where you get the 10 to the negative 21. So let's continue on.
Yeah.
Evidence that overwhelmingly tips the scales toward theism. Now let's tackle atheism's best argument, the problem of evil. The argument basically goes like this: if a perfect God exists, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? Some atheists claim that this is like a knockout punch, the ultimate defeater for belief in God. But here's the thing, it's not as strong as it seems on the surface, and I'm about to show you why. All right, we are ready to add our fourth piece of evidence, evil. Go ahead and scroll down here, type in evil.
I mean, imagine we did the same sort of thing that Cameron is doing. We sort of we take evil, and then we take something like hiddenness, and then we take something like, who knows, religious confusion or like religious diversity, and we say that one of them is it's like 10 to the, it's 1 in a trillion on theism, and then another one is like 1 in a billion on theism, and another one is like 1 in a million on theism. We can equally get just by adding these other pieces of evidence and plugging in similar numbers. If we think that these are super duper surprising on theism, then we'll be able to just cancel out relatively quickly the evidential confirmation that Cam was just raising. So anyway, that's another thing that I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. There isn't some grand revelation that comes here at the end. The grand revelation that comes at the end is if you start thinking that atheism has a prior, is 1 in 10 to the 16th or whatever times less likely.
I think it was 1 in 10 to the negative 21. That's what it was basically.
Yeah, well, that's the odds of atheism accommodating the evidence, but the number of times less likely it was than theism, I think, was negative 1 in 10 to the 16th or something. If you do that, then even when you update on the problem of evil, you get a low credence in atheism. This isn't news. Yes, if you're almost certain that a view is false, and then you update on some evidence, and you don't assign it crazy weights, then you'll be pretty sure that the view is false at the end of it. But just obviously, the thing that the atheist is going to resist is the judgment that prior to considering evil, you should think that atheism is that the odds of atheism, given the other evidence, are roughly on the order of the odds of winning the lottery twice in a row with 2 randomly bought tickets.
Okay, sorry, I was reading the thing. Paul Thompson says, Joe, the proper terminology is 1 in 10 to the 18. Oh yeah, if I said 1 in 10 to the negative 18, that was a mistake. It's 1 times. Whenever I say the negative, I'm trying to say 1 times 10 to the negative 21. If I said 1 in, 10 to the negative something, that would be a mistake, yes. So it would be 1 in 10 to the negative excuse me, 1 in 10 to the 21, which is just 1, times 10 to the negative 21. There we go. So if I said in and I used a negative, I should have said times instead of in. So yeah, there we go. But good catch, Paul. Leave it up to Paul to save the day, man.
Wow.
There we go. All right, we're ready to assign our value, our first value. So let's start with perfect being theism. If God exists, why would he allow evil? One plausible answer, one answer that I find really plausible, is what philosophers call the soul-building theodicy. The idea here is that challenges, suffering, and even tragedy can serve a purpose. They shape us into better, stronger, and more virtuous beings. Think of it like going to the gym, right? There's no pain, no gain. Moreover, there are a lot of great goods that can't exist without
children getting
courage.
cancer. It's just like going to the gym. It shapes us into better,
Right.
better people.
Self-sacrifice.
Or like getting raped, it's like, it's the gym, like, build your strength, it's not like these are very often psychologically degraded, completely degrading and completely soul destroying for many people. But
yeah, I mean, I do think we do have to be careful about making predictions about things that are soul destroying when there's on theism likely to be an infinite afterlife. And
we're going to get into afterlife considerations. Then you talk about, well, is that an auxiliary hypothesis? How probable is that under theism? Does this amount to mere compensation for the relevant evils, or can it serve as justification? Then you're getting to like defeat conditions, and then yes, of course, you get into all the nitty gritty details. So I'm only offering one further level in the dialectic of a response, but there are other responses to that, and then counter responses, and then counter responses, and so on. So I'm fully aware of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna try turning my camera on again.
Because you've been cruising pretty well. People they want to see your beautiful face. They've been they've all just been like, damn it, man! Like I really want to see Matthew. And then
the people are hungry for my face.
They're incredibly hungry. They're like licking their tomps.
Being might judge that those greater goods should exist to at least a degree, but then he need to permit evil. There's also been some.
You know what? Let me pause this right now. Everyone smash the like button, please. It's free. It helps the video. It helps spread this news. If you think that we pointed out some pretty serious criticisms in Cameron's video, the more you like it, the more it's likely to reach people who would have otherwise been duped by those mistakes. Maybe duped is the wrong word, because maybe that suggests intent on Cameron's part, but who would have been misled by that. So you're actually liking the video can actually sort of increase the, epistemic virtue of people, literally, because it's putting this video out to them, and that's making them aware of these objections and whatnot. So if you can, please smash that like button, just like I smashed your mother last night. So that's what you need to do.
Wait, sorry, you're referring, I assume, to the commenters?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Really intelligent extensions of this theodicy to cover animal suffering. Now, does this mean that evil is sort of guaranteed under perfect being theism if we have a theodicy like this? I don't necessarily think so, but it's also not wildly unexpected either. So let's assign the likelihood of observing evil under perfect being theism a conservative 10% or 0.1. As you can see here, a lot of the possibility space is being...
Pause for a sec. So, okay. If the fact is just there's bad stuff somewhere in the universe. Like, okay, I don't know, maybe 1 in 10 is I mean, that seems too high. But there are, shocker, there are more specific facts about evil. So the world is sort of filled with all these evils. They seem to play out in this roughly indifferent way, where there are these kind of blind natural processes that lead to deeply horrible things. You get children getting cancer as there being no correlation between people's virtues and evil. You get all sorts of seemingly gratuitous evils that God is in a position to prevent if he's omnipotent, and that he doesn't prevent. The rose deer dying in the forest fire. Like, taken together, all these things, I think, are a good for a Bayes factor of at least in the thousands, this is at least extremely surprising given theism. Just imagine you were told, like, okay, God exists. What do you expect the world to look like? Like, okay, maybe you'd expect there to be some bad things that lead directly to soul building or something, but you wouldn't expect there to be just like grotesque horrors lasting about 1 billion, having been going on for about 1 billion years, where nearly every being who ever lives a short life of intense suffering, mostly dying after a few days or weeks, where in most cases it's hard to trace out like very great goods that come out of their actions, where even in the case of like developed, even in the case of like creatures like humans, like for most of history, about half of people have died in childbirth. So just this immense scope of evil. Now, all of this is in the power of an omnipotent being to prevent, and yet he prevents almost none of it. The laws seem roughly indifferent to how things play out. So it's not like well, whether the boulder falls depends on whether it's good to fall. All of this would be like staggeringly surprising on the assumption that God exists. Now, I think it's not so surprising that it disqualifies theism, because I think there are a lot of different converging lines of evidence. I think this is the only really impressive argument for atheism. Maybe there's one more impressive argument for atheism, but at the very least, it's strong evidence. At the very least, it's like in the 1 in several thousand given theism, and that strikes me as pretty conservative. But yeah, I mean, just 1 in 10 just seems very silly.
Yeah, that's in my view monstrously high. But the audience knows my views about the problem of evil. I'm very sympathetic to the considerations that you raised. I think this is extremely various facts about evil. Not just that there is evil. Various facts about evil are extraordinarily surprising on theism in my view, but
yeah, like sorry, just okay, imagine this one fact. Okay, you're in a dark room, you're told, okay, God exists, and you're like, okay, what odds do you give to the world containing the rape of children? Like, you're not gonna say, oh, I think that's like 1 in 10 probability. Like, what?
or like, yeah, like or like the mode of creation, you're not gonna think that it's like hundreds of millions of years of animals like ripping each other to shreds, and basically like the natural state is like a state of scarcity and starvation and misery and like eviscerating each other.
Yeah, now I mean we have to be careful to like anytime you build in specific evidence, it'll be surprising on both theism and atheism, right? So we don't want to say like, oh, here's a really surprising fact on theism. My phone number, the odds of it are 1 in 10 to the 9th, right? Because you have to look at the relative probability. But just like the odds of there being the kinds of evils that we have in our world strike me as like obviously well below 1 in 10 chance given theism.
Back to the Cameron video.
Cut away on theism here. All right, so what about limited theism? A limited deity might not have the power to prevent evil, or they might just not care enough to try, or he might, like lots of people, be on the whole very good, but sometimes falls short. Maybe he just can't see the future, so he can't stop all the evil. There's a lot of possibilities here. Evil under this hypothesis is therefore plausible, but it's not guaranteed. So let's set this probability at 50%, 0.5. Now for atheism, some might think that evil is sort of like a given under atheism. After all, why wouldn't there be suffering in a godless universe with conscious creatures?
So I think, what did he say the odds were of consciousness given the limited? It was like
50%.
Oh, wait, of consciousness given the limited deities?
Oh, sorry. You said consciousness. Oh, I don't remember. Yeah. Wasn't that like 10% or something?
Yeah, but there was, I think for one of them, like for fine tuning or something, it was like 1 in a million, I think.
Huh.
I think that was the number. Right, so he thinks that the odds of a limited deity making evil are like tens of thousands of times higher than the odds of them making a finely tuned world. I think, though I'd have to look back at the numbers, but I mean, none of this is at all plausible.
Well, let's again be generous to the atheist and set this probability at 1 or 100%. We'll just assume that if atheism is true, evil and suffering is an absolute given. When we plug these numbers, these probabilities.
But again, part of this framing is very frustrating, because again, it's not that like it's given atheism. It's given atheism and fine-tuning and order and consciousness, right? So like that, I mean, we should at least be keeping that in mind when we're assigning all these numbers.
With conscious creatures, but let's again be generous to the atheist and set this probability at 1 or 100%. We'll just assume that if atheism is true, evil and suffering is an absolute given. When we plug these numbers, these probabilities into the software, here's what happens. All right, perfect being theism, still overwhelmingly dominant. Limited theism,
right? Because the base factor here is just 10 to 1. I mean, of course that's not going to swamp the, 10 to the power of 21 or whatever.
Yeah. Surprising, mind-blowing fact that we need this Bayes sheet to tell us. 10 is a much smaller number than a billion times a trillion.
Still pretty tiny. Atheism still barely clinging to relevance. Like, you literally need scientific notation to even understand how improbable atheism is. But let's raise the stakes. Let's grant the atheist their best
I
case
will say
scenario. Let's say
that's a funny line, that you need scientific notation to understand how. Like, that's just a hilarious thing to say about a view. I'm going to start saying that about Thomism. Like, you need scientific notation to understand how improbable Thomism is.
problem of evil is so powerful that the probability of observing evil under perfect being theism drops to 1 in 100,000. So we'll adjust this number, 0.000001. All right, so what happens in this scenario? As you can see, in this unlikely scenario, the odds now slightly favor perfect being theism over limited theism. So we've got a final probability of perfect being theism is about 83%, limited theism about 16%, and then atheism is, again, virtually non-existent. But maybe you're not convinced. Maybe you think the problem of evil has way more force than even that. So let's get super dumb and let's assign the probability of 1 in a trillion just to see what happens. 0.0000000000001. So as you can see,
There's one too many zeros there.
in this scenario, all we've done is basically rule out perfect being theism and atheism. So look what happened to limited theism. The software is now rounding up to 1 or 100%, pretty much. In other words, theism still wins by a long shot. So here's the point.
That's arguably because we gave limited theism a non-negligible intrinsic probability. But like, lots of atheists who are going to be running the problem of evil are going to be assigning limited theism either negligible or close to negligible intrinsic probability. And hey, there are at least some reasons that might push one to do that. Maybe drawing on some of the reasons that I gave in my previous response video.
Yeah, I will say, like, Cameron's like, assume this totally crazy number, 1 in 100,000 of evil on atheism, on theism rather. Like, when you look at the pattern of evils in our world, that doesn't actually strike me as that crazy of a number. In fact, I remember when I was plugging things into my Bayes spreadsheet when I was an agnostic, deciding between theism and atheism. That was the number that I went with. Well, actually, it was 1 over 100,001 to make the math easier, but basically the same thing. It was an odds ratio of 1 to 100,000. Like, that doesn't strike me as that unreasonable. I'd probably lower it by like an order of magnitude to like 10,000 or something, or maybe in the thousands. But like, I don't know, it's not totally crazy. It's certainly a lot less crazy to think that's the right number than to think that fine tuning is a trillion to 1 evidence, or that consciousness is 1,000,000 to 1 evidence.
Of all this, the problem of evil isn't the theism destroying argument it's often made out to be. At most, it might challenge the idea of a perfect God, but it doesn't make atheism more plausible or more probable than theism. And in fact, it leaves atheism basically exactly where it started, a long shot. And don't forget, we didn't even use the real numbers for fine tuning. If we had, atheism's chance of survival wouldn't just be slim, it would be microscopic. Like, you'd need to use.
And don't forget, audience, that his methodology is demonstrably flawed in several different respects that we've pointed out in this video.
Yeah,
a microscope.
I think we need scientific notation to understand the probability of Cameron's methodology is sound and his numbers are reasonable.
Just to hope to find it. But here's the thing, okay? I don't think theists are backed into a corner that they have to embrace limited theism. In fact, I firmly believe that the problem of evil has very strong answers. I've already mentioned the soul-building theodicy. Perfect being theism, I think, remains the best option on the table. But even in the absolute worst case scenario, the right move isn't to jump ship to atheism, it's to consider limited theism. Having said all of this, if you're still taking atheism as a serious hypothesis about reality, maybe it's time to start asking why. If you want to dive even deeper into why belief in God isn't just reasonable, it's the best explanation for reality, then click on this video right here. Go ahead and click on it, because I'm just going to be waiting here awkwardly until you do.
Okay, I will give that video is really good. And any video with Robin Collins talking about fine tuning is inevitably very good. And any video with Josh Rasmussen is inevitably good. And so that video overall is good. The inevitable response from Joe
Can't wait for the inevitable response from Joe Schmidt. Well, you're right, Will Forbes. It was inevitable.
Yeah. I mean, so, I think our concluding thoughts.
You can offer concluding thoughts. I'm going to look through a lot of these comments.
Yeah. I'm getting distracted by the comments, but okay. The conclude. So I think I think that the methodology is a decent one to use, at least as not as the thing that ultimately determines whether theism versus atheism is right.
By the methodology, you need to clarify, like just developing toy Bayesian models where we are careful to include at least relevant hypotheses.
That's what I meant. Yeah, I think that's reasonable, and I think I would disagree with some of Cameron's critics. Like I think lots of his critics would say like, these numbers are entirely made up, and like yes, the numbers are slightly made up, but you can often get helpful results from numbers that are a little bit made up. Like if you want to, like for example, if you want to, I was reading a book about fine tuning. If you want to figure out like whether or not, which are there more like cells in livers of humans or more legs on ants across the earth? Like this is a very hard question to figure out from the armchair. Why? But if you just sort of assign toy numbers to it, where you're like, okay, assume there are 10 million ants for every human, and then look at the number, and then you just sort of do the division, you actually can get pretty good estimates that get decently close to the truth. Like generally, so long as the numbers don't differ by too many orders of magnitude, you usually can get a decent, to within a few orders of magnitude estimate by using toy numbers. I'd once again recommend the article. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing with made up numbers. But if you're going to be, doing probabilistic analysis with largely made up numbers, where the numbers, there's some degree of arbitrariness, you're not deriving them from some formal process, then you want to sort of actually be serious about the numbers. You want to, try to assign conservative estimates for the things if you think it's giving a reasonable conservative estimate. You don't just want to pull, a trillion out of your ass. And I think this is. Serious Bayesian toy model application is not something that Cameron did adequately in this video.
That's an understatement by multiple. We need scientific notation to say how much of an understatement that was. We need to see some of these. I know we're just shooting the shit now, but Joe Schmidt about to do a 5-hour video response to a 30-minute vid. Hey, Duke of Denver, it was only 2.5 hours. Okay, so I'd appreciate if you get your facts straight. Let's see, any others? Hey, Kevin's here.
Yeah, I actually immediately before this, I was watching a debate between Kevin and David Paulman about whether the gospel authors were whether like the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark and so on. And yeah, I hadn't seen Kevin much before, but yeah, he seemed like a smart guy. Yeah, I guess one thing so I knew you had a long video about this, but I guess I can briefly give my thoughts about the limited God hypothesis. So like I have a decent credence in atheism and a decent credence in like perfect being theism, but I have a pretty low credence in
Keep on going. This is good.
Yeah, I have a pretty low credence in the limited God. And the reason for that is I think it's sort of an unhappy medium where it's the worst of both worlds. It's like I think there are three really strong arguments for theism. And those arguments are the anthropic argument, which you should all check out my recent blog article about, where I give a comprehensive guide to all the objections and explain why you need scientific notation to understand just how bad they are. The anthropic argument, psychophysical harmony, and fine-tuning. I think like these are the top three arguments. And I think basically none of these are well explained by a limited deity. The limited deity just pushes the fine-tuning problem back a level because the limited deity needs to have its powers and desires finely tuned in order to make it probable that it would bring about a world like ours. So I think it pushes the fine-tuning problem back a level. A perfect being doesn't do that because it has just one core unlimited property, like being a limitless consciousness or being limitless goodness or being limitless, act or whatever the Thomists say. I think with the anthropic argument, the data is that some huge infinity worth of people exist, and most limited gods won't be able to create that. And then with psychophysical harmony, you don't have a deeper explanation of why the limited God is psychophysically harmonious. And then it doesn't explain evil that well, because like it's puzzling why the limited God doesn't intervene in lots of ways to prevent evil. Thanks, J-Rock. Nice sentiment. So I think like the limited God hypothesis is the sort of unhappy medium where I think it just gets the worst of both worlds, where it doesn't explain either the theistic data or the naturalistic data very well. And I also think the same thing will apply more broadly with some of the like second tier arguments for theism. But
okay, we've got to see this one. Let's see. Let's wait for Joe Schmidt to get mad and throw 10,000 different views on a particular argument Cameron makes, like they somehow, by virtue of their existence, debunk Cameron's argument. I'm just going to prepare myself to watch a 5-hour video of his that could have been 30 minutes. Well, hey, firstly, this is not 5 hours. Okay, get your facts straight. It was only 2.5 hours. Secondly, could this have been 30 minutes? I don't know about that. Would it have contained as many good jokes? I don't know. I don't think so. But hey, I thought it was a quality video. And then let's wait for Joshua to get mad. Hey, I don't really get mad. I more so just get disappointed in people's bad reasoning. And throw 10,000 different views on a particular argument that Cameron makes, like they somehow, by virtue of their existence, debunk Cameron's argument. I have never once argued that throwing a bunch of different views on a table and saying that somehow, by virtue of their existence, they debunk an argument. Rather, whenever I bring up various different views, and people very often miss this point because they're hopelessly confused about the nature of undercutting defeaters, when I bring up oftentimes different views about something, like a panoply of different views, it's because I'm pointing out that the apologist or the proponent of the theistic argument is far too quick to infer either that a particular metaphysical hypothesis is true, or that God is the foundation of reality, or something like that. And they're far too quick in that because there are lots of other views about the foundation of reality, say, or lots of other metaphysical views that one could take about the topic, which the apologist or the proponent of the theistic argument would have to systematically rule out. And yet, if they fail to rule those out, as they very often do, then their argument, their case faces an undercutting defeater. They have not adequately justified why God would be the foundation, or why we should accept that specific metaphysical view about the topic in question, as opposed to one of the others. So bringing up different views is very often perfectly legitimate when it's situated within the context of developing an undercutting defeater, because you're pointing out that the apologist, in order to infer their favored view, would have to systematically rule out the competing views, which proponents of theistic arguments very often fail to do in various contexts. So when I oftentimes see people make this comment where it's like, hey, just raising possibilities like this doesn't refute the theist argument. It's like you're just hopelessly confused about the nature of undercutting defeaters. I'm just pointing out that the theist would have to systematically rule all of these alternatives out, incompatible with their view, in order to justify their view, and yet they very often do so.
And until they do that, then it seems that the atheist has demonstrated that there is no God.
Right.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, with respect to the moral argument, this very often comes up where it's like, listen, there are a panoply of potential groundings of morality outside of God. The onus isn't on me to justify the truth of those things. And I'm not saying that just by virtue of their mere existence, they refute the theist's view or they refute the theist's argument. The point is that in order for the theist to infer that God is the grounding of morality, as they want to do with their argument, they are the ones with the burden, with the positive onus, with the duty to systematically proceed through these alternative groundings, non-theistic groundings of morality, and show that all of them are false. And they almost uniformly fail to do that. And that's the value of bringing up the relevant alternative views. It's not just saying that their bare existence somehow refutes or debunks the argument. It's pointing out that in order to infer that theism specifically is the best or only grounding for morality, you would have to systematically proceed through all the others and rule them out, which theists almost never do, or proponents of the moral argument almost never do. And that's why it's perfectly legitimate to bring those up. It's an undercutting defeater, which YouTube commenters seem to have a particularly difficult time with.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like, I don't know, so this is going to be a weird analogy, but one argument that I've heard some Jewish apologists make is they say the truth of Judaism is the only plausible explanation for the continued survival of the Jewish people. And now, regarding this argument, I think Well, if you want to make that argument confidently, you have to like look into all the accounts that historians have of like why the Jews have survived for so long. You want to have some account of why none of these can be plausible, right? It isn't enough to just be like, oh, to just assert that it's the only account and then be like, well, ask incredulously what the other account is. No, you have to have a reason to think there isn't some other account. And people seem not to do this with the moral argument. By the way, I unfortunately, I have recently been debunked on the anthropic argument. One commenter informed me in the chat just now that, quote, the anthropic argument is crap. It's tautological spelled incorrectly. Now, of course, if something is tautological, it's trivial and true. It's true. Tautology is something that's like trivially true in all possible worlds. So like, okay, I agree. I disagree with the first part of the sentence, but I agree that the anthropic argument is true in all possible worlds. In all possible worlds, you should think it's right.
Okay. I think we've looked at enough comments for today. That's enough for Joe. My brain can only handle a certain number of comments from YouTube. Okay. Well, audience, I hope you enjoyed that. This 2.5 hour long response. I really don't have much to offer by way of summary. I made my criticisms throughout the video, and I made a number of them, and you guys can just rewatch the video if you want a sense of my criticisms. Matthew, do you have any concluding remarks? I know you already kind of offered a summary, but any just closing comments?
I mean, when you're getting numbers for things, if you're trying to be conservative, you should not have a number that's 9 orders of magnitude or something more than what, like, even a person who thinks the argument is really good thinks the argument is worth.
Yeah, someone is saying, I'm feeling lazy today. Yeah, that reminds me of when I got accused of being lazy for making a 12-hour response video.
Oh my God, that was so ridiculous.
Drawing on extensively published literature and my own like papers under review and like my own things.
What you should have done was instead just like thrown together a bunch of like syllogisms of like poorly written syllogisms that you'd found from like the scholarly literature and just like presented them. Maybe like briefly discussed a reason why a person might think they're wrong and like, criticize that, usually very briefly. Like that would have been much more intellectually responsible.
Yeah. And then I was also accused of not even earning the right, not even having the right to criticize some of the arguments. I was like, what? Anyway, I responded to that video that people can check out if they want on my channel. I think it's called like, Was I Lazy or something like that. But anyway, thanks, Matthew, for coming on. Audience, if you enjoyed this video, what'd you say?
Oh, I was just saying, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, everyone, if you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button, share it with all your friends and your family members and your coworkers and your philosophy teachers, and just say like, hey, check out this Majesty of Reason fella channel, because it's great. So,
Also encourage people to check out Bentham's.
Oh, yeah. Of course. Don't forget Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions. Lots of great discussions. So check out Matthew's channel. I've linked in the description. Check out Matthew's Substack. Subscribe to both of our Patreons. And thanks to all existing patrons. And thanks to everyone who makes one-time donations. It means a lot. And thanks to all the commenters here. And I guess we'll close it out. What better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason. And peace out.